At the annual Christmas party, my father stood before 150 elite guests and looked me dead in the eye. "You should have never existed," he stated, his voice carrying clearly over the string quartet. The grand ballroom fell completely silent. Waiters froze in place. Local politicians and corporate titans stared, holding their collective breath. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life trying to erase me, smiled a cold, genuine smile, and replied, "Then consider me dead." I turned and walked out the heavy oak doors into the freezing snow. 15 minutes later, the entire Beacon Hill mansion erupted into sheer panic. What they found sitting on the credenza made them regret every single syllable they had ever spoken to me. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my father's entire corporate empire line by line, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a permanent boundary with toxic relatives. My name is Serenity. I am 31 years old, and I operate as a forensic data architect. I build the digital nervous systems that track global logistics, and I hunt down the hidden discrepancies that destroy companies. To the corporate world, I am an apex problem solver, but to my family, I was merely the designated disappointment. I was the daughter who refused to join the ranks of Vanguard Logistics, the corporate empire my father, Silas, ruled with an iron fist. They viewed my quiet, independent life as a direct insult to their status. They had absolutely no idea that my independence was the only thing keeping their hollow aristocratic illusion from collapsing into total ruin. To understand the catastrophic breaking point of that winter evening, you must understand the suffocating orchestration of my family's home. The air inside the Beacon Hill mansion smelled of roasted pine and expensive bourbon. Crystal chandeliers cast sharp, unforgiving light across the polished marble floors. I stood near the edge of the grand living room, gripping a flute of sparkling water, entirely isolated in a sea of velvet and silk. Silas dominated the center of the room. He clapped state senators on the shoulder and projected the flawless image of a logistics titan. Vanguard Logistics was his kingdom, and he wore his arrogance like a bespoke suit. Gideon, my older brother and the vice president of Vanguard, mirrored him perfectly. Gideon held a glass of scotch, laughing too loudly at jokes he did not understand. I watched him snap his fingers impatiently at a passing waiter, demanding a fresh drink. He possessed absolutely zero business acumen, yet he paraded around the room accepting congratulations for contracts he had never read. My mother, Lorraine, drifted between the guests, adjusting floral arrangements and ensuring the pantomime of a perfect dynasty remained spotless. She spotted me standing near the archway and abandoned a conversation with a local judge to intercept me. Her fingers closed around my wrist, her manicured nails biting sharply into my skin. "Stand up straight, Serenity," Lorraine hissed, her smile never faltering for the audience around us. "Gideon is securing a major supply chain partnership tonight. Your father needs to project absolute unity. Do not ruin the aesthetic with your miserable posture." I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my wrist. I did not defend myself. Engaging with Lorraine only fed her relentless need for control. I simply stepped back. Placing physical distance between us, she scoffed, smoothed her designer gown, and glided away to fetch Silas another drink. The string quartet abruptly shifted tempos, signaling the main event. Silas tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound commanded immediate obedience. The low hum of conversation vanished. 150 faces turned toward the grand staircase. Silas puffed out his chest, stepping up to the first marble stair to elevate himself above his peers. He launched into a booming speech about the resilience of the Vanguard legacy. He spoke of aggressive expansion and ruthless market dominance. He gestured expansively toward Gideon, praising his son's supposed brilliance and declaring him the undisputed future of the company. The crowd applauded on cue. Gideon smirked, raising his scotch glass in triumphant acknowledgement. Then, Silas shifted his predatory focus. His eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. He motioned with his hand, demanding I step forward. The crowd parted instantly, creating a long, narrow aisle of staring eyes. I did not shrink. I kept my spine rigid and walked slowly to the center of the ballroom, stopping exactly 6 feet away from the staircase. Of course, true expansion requires absolute familial loyalty, Silas announced, his voice taking on a dark, theatrical edge. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a folded legal document. My father, Thaddeus, left a substantial trust fund behind. It was meant to secure the future of Vanguard. Tonight, Serenity is going to demonstrate her commitment to our legacy by formally signing that trust over to Gideon, ensuring our operational capital remains impenetrable. The coiled spring in my chest pulled taut. Grandfather Thaddeus was the only person in this bloodline who had ever valued my intellect. He saw my potential when Silas only saw a failure. Thaddeus had deliberately bypassed my father and brother, leaving that trust exclusively in my name to ensure I had the freedom to escape their parasitic grip. Silas descended the final step. He thrust a gold fountain pen toward my chest. He was weaponizing the peer pressure of 150 elite guests, calculating that I would be too embarrassed to cause a public scene. He expected me to bow my head, sign away my grandfather's protection, and shrink back into the shadows. I did not reach for the pen. I looked at the legal document, then shifted my gaze to Gideon's smug, entitled face, and finally locked eyes with my father. No, I stated. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silent ballroom with surgical precision. That trust belongs to me. I will not liquidate grandfather's legacy to subsidize Gideon's gross incompetence. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of guests. Gideon's smug expression dissolved into a flush of violent red. Lorraine covered her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer panic at the destruction of her perfect social facade. Silas's face darkened. The polished veneer of the aristocratic CEO evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, venomous malice. He closed the distance between us, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp tang of scotch on his breath. He did not care about the audience anymore. He only cared about crushing my defiance. "You are a useless, ungrateful burden," Silas snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute disgust. "You contribute nothing. You are nothing. You should have never existed." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was heavy enough to shatter bone. No one moved. No one dared to draw a breath. I stood perfectly still for 31 years. I had absorbed their insults. I had swallowed their disrespect to maintain a fractured peace. But hearing those exact words spoken into the dead air of that grand ballroom did not break my heart. It set me completely free. A heavy, iron lock clicked open inside my mind. The obligations of blood and loyalty vanished, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. I smiled. It was not a smile of sorrow or submission. It was the expression of a forensic architect who had just decided to demolish a building. "Then consider me dead," I replied. I turned my back on the man who had just erased me. I walked down the aisle of stunned guests. I did not rush my steps. I passed the imported mahogany credenza positioned near the heavy oak entryway. Tucked tightly under my left arm was a navy leather portfolio. I loosened my grip. The portfolio slipped from my fingers, landing against the polished wood with a heavy, definitive thud. I pushed the heavy front doors open. The biting winter wind hit my face, carrying the sharp sting of fresh snow. I walked down the stone steps and climbed into my car, leaving the suffocating heat of the mansion behind forever. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded an insubordinate daughter. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside that navy leather portfolio. They did not know that 2 years ago. When Vanguard Logistics was secretly drowning in debt, I had anonymously bailed them out. I had built the proprietary data routing algorithm that kept their delivery trucks moving, leasing it to them through a ghost corporation named Aegis Systems. Inside that portfolio sat the formal legal termination of the Aegis algorithm, alongside the immediate withdrawal authorization for $4 million in anonymous infrastructure funding. I put my car into drive and let the tires crunch against the fresh snow, fully aware that the countdown to their absolute annihilation had just begun. I navigated my car down the winding, snow-covered streets of Beacon Hill. The heater blasted against my freezing skin, but the cold inside my chest felt entirely comfortable. I did not turn on the radio. I listened to the steady crunch of the tires pressing into the fresh snow. I felt the profound absence of the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 31 years. I did not witness the immediate fallout of my exit. Daphne, my brother's wife, provided the forensic breakdown of those 15 minutes. We sat in a quiet coffee shop weeks later, and she reconstructed the collapse of the Vanguard empire, piece by piece. According to Daphne, the grand ballroom remained paralyzed long after the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. 150 elite guests stared at the empty entryway. No one moved. No one spoke. Silas broke the stillness. He threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It lacked genuine warmth, sounding more like a hammer striking hollow metal. He waved a hand dismissively toward the foyer. "You must excuse the dramatics," Silas announced, projecting his voice to reach the back of the room. "Serenity always buckles under the weight of real business. She prefers to run away rather than contribute. We will process the trust transfer without her." He signaled a passing waiter, swapping his empty champagne flute for a heavy crystal tumbler of aged scotch. Lorraine immediately mirrored his pivot. She smoothed the fabric of her evening gown, turned to the string quartet, and snapped her fingers twice. The musicians scrambled to arrange their sheet music. The cellist dragged his bow across the strings, striking a disjointed, nervous chord before settling into a rapid classical waltz. The guests complied with the orchestration. They resumed their conversations, sipping champagne and forcing tight smiles. Gideon marched toward the private bar, pouring himself a generous measure of bourbon. He slammed the decanter down, muttering insults under his breath. The party restarted, but the foundation carried a visible fracture. The aristocracy smelled blood in the water. Daphne retreated toward the perimeter. She wanted to escape the stifling proximity of Silas and his sycophants. She wandered into the quiet expanse of the foyer, intending to retrieve her coat and slip away. Instead, she noticed the credenza. Resting perfectly centered on the polished mahogany surface sat my navy leather portfolio. Daphne approached it slowly. She knew my habits. She knew I operated with ruthless precision. I did not leave items behind in fits of emotional distress. I did not misplace documents. Daphne reached out and touched the cool leather. A thick brass clasp secured the flap. She unfastened it. She slid the top document halfway out of the sleeve. The header bore the embossed logo of Aegis Systems. Daphne recognized the name instantly. Aegis Systems was a revered entity within the walls of Vanguard Logistics. 2 years prior, Vanguard faced a catastrophic routing failure. Delivery fleets stalled, contracts evaporated, bankruptcy loomed. Then, Aegis Systems materialized, offering a proprietary logistics algorithm and a massive influx of capital that rescued the company from the brink. Silas spoke of the anonymous Aegis founder with deep, groveling reverence. Daphne stared at the premium paper. Why did the family disappointment possess official documents from the firm's savior? She pushed the pages back inside and fastened the clasp. She knew Silas ruled through information control. Handing him this portfolio offered her a rare sliver of leverage. She picked it up, feeling the substantial weight of the paper, and walked back into the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Silas stood near the towering limestone fireplace, dominating a conversation with a commercial real estate developer. Gideon flanked him, nursing his bourbon and nodding vigorously at whatever Silas dictated. Daphne stepped directly into their circle. Silas narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated by the interruption. He despised when wives inserted themselves into business discussions. "She left this on the credenza," Daphne stated, extending the navy portfolio toward his chest. Silas scoffed. He snatched the leather folder from her hands. A smug, victorious sneer stretched across his face. "Of course she did," Silas boasted, turning back to the real estate developer. "She puts on a pathetic theatrical display for the crowd, but she lacks the spine to actually disobey me. She signed the trust documents and left them by the door like a scolded child. Gideon, prepare the legal team to absorb the capital." Gideon grinned, swallowing the rest of his bourbon. Silas flipped the brass clasp open. He peeled back the leather cover. Daphne watched his face. She watched the smug arrogance hold for exactly 3 seconds. Silas read the first paragraph. His jaw went slack. The blood drained from his cheeks, rushing away and leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His eyes darted back to the top of the page, reading the lines a second time, then a third. This was not the transfer deed for Thaddeus's trust. It was a formal notice of termination. The document explicitly detailed the immediate revocation of the core proprietary routing algorithm powering every single Vanguard logistics supply chain. The code would go dark. The trucks would stop. The empire would blindfold itself. Silas flipped frantically to the second page. The paper rattled in his trembling hands. The second document outlined a scheduled capital extraction. It demanded the immediate withdrawal of $4 million in anonymous infrastructure funding. The effective date glared from the center of the page in bold, black ink, January 1st. Silas lost the ability to draw breath. His chest heaved, but no air filled his lungs. Vanguard Logistics did not possess $4 million in liquid capital. They operated on razor-thin margins, entirely dependent on the Aegis algorithm to maintain their contracts. Extracting that money meant immediate, inescapable insolvency. His eyes dragged downward to the signature line. He expected to see the stamp of a faceless corporate proxy. He expected to see a generic legal firm representing the phantom savior of his company. Instead, he saw a wet ink signature. He recognized the sharp, aggressive slant of the cursive letters. He recognized the name. Aegis Systems was not a massive corporate entity. Aegis Systems was the daughter he had just humiliated, the daughter he had just erased, the daughter who had single-handedly built the digital architecture keeping him out of federal bankruptcy court. The realization hit him with the kinetic force of a freight train. His knees buckled slightly. The muscles in his hand failed. The heavy crystal tumbler of aged scotch slipped from his grip. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished marble. The glass shattered. The sharp, violent crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling, slicing through the music and silencing the string quartet mid-measure. Amber liquid and razor-sharp shards exploded across the pristine tiles, splashing against the polished leather of his shoes. 150 guests snapped their heads toward the fireplace. The low hum of elite conversation died instantly. "Silas!" Lorraine gasped, rushing forward, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. "Silas, what is it? Are you having an episode?" Gideon stepped closer, staring at the shattered glass and then at his father's gray, terrified face. "Dad, what did she sign?" Silas could not answer. He stared at the Navy portfolio, his mouth opening and closing in a desperate, silent rhythm. The illusion of his impenetrable dynasty crumbled right there on the wet marble. The festive warmth of the Christmas party vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The attendees stared, completely paralyzed, watching the patriarch of Vanguard Logistics physically implode. Daphne stepped backward, melting into the shadows of the crowd. She watched the panic infect the room, spreading from Gideon to Lorraine and rippling out toward the guests. Silas finally gasped for air, his chest hitching violently. He clutched the termination papers to his chest, realizing that his public execution of my character had just triggered his own absolute annihilation. The streets of Boston blurred past the windshield. I steered the car away from the towering, iron-gated mansions of Beacon Hill, descending toward the affluent, quiet rows of Back Bay. The heater hummed, thawing the ice from my knuckles. I anticipated a sanctuary. I anticipated Desmond. We had shared the tri-level brownstone for 3 years. I expected him to pour a glass of Cabernet, listen to the clinical autopsy of the Christmas party, and validate my boundary. I expected a partner who operated outside the toxic orbit of Vanguard Logistics. Desmond was a senior associate at a cutthroat corporate law firm. He understood the mechanics of power. I assumed he respected mine. I parked the car in the private, heated garage beneath the brownstone. I unlocked the heavy security door, stepping into the warmth of the foyer. The house smelled of expensive cedar and the citrus cologne Desmond favored. I toppled my snow-covered boots onto the rubber mat, ensuring the melting slush did not stain the pristine Brazilian cherry hardwood. The house wrapped around me, perfectly climate-controlled and immaculately curated. I unbuttoned my wool coat, hanging it on the brass hook. A voice shattered the silence. It drifted down the spiral staircase from the second-floor home office. "Desmond," he spoke rapidly, the cadence sharp and frantic, entirely stripped of his usual practiced courtroom drawl. I climbed the stairs. My stockinged feet made absolutely zero sound against the thick carpet runner. I approached the office. The heavy mahogany door stood ajar, spilling a wedge of yellow light across the hallway floor. I pressed my back against the wall, merging with the shadows. I peered through the narrow gap. Desmond paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He pressed his smartphone hard against his ear. His free hand chopped through the air, emphasizing his words. "Silas, you need to stop hyperventilating and listen to the legal reality." Desmond snapped. My breath caught in my throat. "Silas, my fiancé was speaking to the man who had just publicly erased me. I do not care about the shattered glass in your ballroom." Desmond continued, pivoting on his heel. "I care about the $4 million. I care about the Aegis algorithm. You are telling me Serenity holds the termination keys to your entire supply chain." A muffled, frantic squawk bled through the phone's receiver. My father was bleeding panic, begging for a lifeline. "No, Silas, do not alert the bank. Do not alert your board of directors," Desmond commanded, dropping into his tufted leather executive chair. "If the board discovers Vanguard Logistics is insolvent, they will strip you of your title by morning. We neutralize Serenity first. We build a cage she cannot code her way out of." Desmond grabbed a silver fountain pen and pulled a yellow legal pad across the desk. "We file an emergency ex parte conservatorship tomorrow at dawn. We petition the probate court to declare her mentally unfit to manage her financial affairs." I stood frozen in the hallway. A conservatorship, the ultimate, inescapable legal cage. It was the atomic bomb of family law, designed to strip a human being of their fundamental autonomy. "Think about the narrative, Silas," Desmond urged, his tone shifting into smooth, predatory confidence. "She just caused a massive public scene in front of 150 of your closest investors and associates. She abandoned her family on Christmas Eve. We draft a medical affidavit claiming she suffered a severe psychotic break due to workplace stress. We argue she possesses a danger to herself and your corporate infrastructure. The judge freezes all her assets pending a psychological evaluation. That invalidates the Aegis withdrawal notice immediately. We seize her server access. We secure the $4 million, and we take control of Thaddeus's trust fund in the process. She becomes a ward of the state. She becomes your property." Another muffled response transmitted from the phone. Silas was agreeing. He was eager to lock his own daughter in a psychiatric ward to save his balance sheet. "Yes, I will draft the petition tonight," Desmond confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, calculating his leverage. "But this level of off-the-books litigation requires immediate compensation. Silas, I am crossing serious ethical boundaries. I want the Vanguard corporate retainer moved exclusively to my desk, and I want the senior partnership recommendations signed, notarized, and delivered to my managing director by Friday." The transaction concluded. Silas bought his survival. Desmond bought his promotion. My freedom served as the currency. I did not gasp. I did not storm into the office, screaming about betrayal. The final fragments of my domestic illusion evaporated. The man I planned to marry did not view me as a human being. He viewed me as a highly profitable asset to be liquidated. A surge of cold, clinical clarity flooded my veins. The lock in my mind, the one that had snapped open at the Christmas party, sealed itself permanently around a new reality. Desmond was a hostile variable. He belonged to the exact same breed of hollow aristocrat as my father. He traded integrity for status. I pushed away from the wall. I did not confront him. Confrontation provided the enemy with data, and I refused to surrender a single byte of information. I moved swiftly down the hall to the master bedroom. I bypassed the walk-in closet filled with the silk dresses and tailored gowns Desmond insisted I wear to his firm's galas. I pulled a rugged, hard-shell suitcase from the top shelf. I packed 3 dark suits, minimal casual clothing, and a single pair of sensible heels. I dropped to my knees and slid the Persian rug aside, exposing the biometric floor safe. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The heavy steel lid hissed open. I ignored the velvet boxes containing diamond necklaces and luxury watches. I extracted what actually mattered: my passport, a stack of untraceable currency, and my Faraday bags. Inside those shielded bags rested the encrypted solid-state drives and the hardware authentication keys to the Aegis network. These drives contained the digital architecture of my entire empire. They held the irrefutable, time-stamped proof of Vanguard's insolvency. Before leaving the bedroom, I walked to my desktop workstation. I pulled a specialized cryptographic flash drive from my pocket, inserted it into the port, and executed a localized wipe. Lines of code cascaded across the monitor. Within 60 seconds, the hard drive erased its own operating system, scrubbing every trace of my local network activity. Desmond would find nothing but dead silicon. I zipped the suitcase shut. The polyurethane wheels glided silently across the hardwood floor. I walked back toward the staircase. I paused outside the home office. Desmond stood with his back to the door, staring out at the falling snow, still negotiating the exact terms of my institutionalization with Silas. I gripped the handle of my suitcase. I took 2 silent steps into the room. Desmond remained entirely focused on the city lights outside. I reached my left hand toward the edge of his mahogany desk. I slid the 3-carat diamond engagement ring off my finger. The metal held absolutely no warmth. It was just carbon and steel, a transactional token marking a fraudulent merger. I held it directly above his printed legal pads, the very pages where he had scribbled the notes to steal my autonomy. I opened my hand. The heavy platinum struck the desk. The metal clinked sharply, a harsh, ringing impact that shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. Desmond flinched. His shoulders went rigid. He spun around, the phone still pressed to his ear, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. But I was already gone. By the time his vision registered the diamond resting on his legal pad, I was moving down the staircase. I pulled my wool coat over my shoulders. I grasped the brass handle of the front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing night. The deadbolt clicked shut behind me, severing the final tie to my past. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the winding roads leading away from Back Bay. The tires gripped the slush, crunching steadily as I steered the sedan toward the Seaport district. The high-rises along the waterfront pierced the low-hanging clouds, their glass facades reflecting the amber glow of the street lamps. I descended a concrete ramp into a subterranean parking garage beneath a towering luxury hotel. I bypassed the valet stand, reversed into an isolated corner spot, cut the engine, and stepped into the frigid, echoing concrete structure. I pulled my hard-shell suitcase from the trunk. The polyurethane wheels rolled smoothly over the asphalt, emitting a rhythmic hum that matched the steady, calculated pace of my heartbeat. The hotel lobby smelled of ozone and expensive lilies. The marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. I approached the concierge desk. The attendant smiled, opening his mouth to ask for my reservation. I did not offer the name my father gave me. I reached into my coat pocket and slid a heavy, black titanium corporate card across the polished stone. The embossed silver lettering read, Aegis Infrastructure Solutions. The attendant glanced at the card, straightened his posture immediately, and typed a sequence into his terminal. He handed me a magnetized keycard in silence and gestured toward a private elevator bank tucked behind a frosted glass partition. The elevator ascended without a single mechanical shudder, depositing me on the top floor. I swiped the keycard. The heavy oak door yielded. The penthouse suite spanned 3,000 square feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the freezing, turbulent waters of the Boston Harbor. I ignored the sprawling panoramic view. I bypassed the velvet sofas and the gas fireplace. I dragged my luggage directly to a massive dining table crafted from a single slab of black obsidian. I unzipped the suitcase. I extracted the shielded Faraday bags, peeling back the protective metal mesh. I withdrew 2 heavily modified, military-grade laptops. I arranged a cluster of encrypted solid-state drives across the stone and connected a compact satellite uplink module to bypass the hotel's unsecure network. I linked the hardware with thick braided cables, establishing an impenetrable local intranet. This space ceased to be a luxury suite. It became a digital command center. I pressed the power buttons. The twin monitors flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue luminescence across the darkened room. Cascading lines of code scrolled down the screens. Biometric protocols demanded verification. I pressed my thumb against the optical scanner and leaned into the retinal reader. The system verified my identity and unlocked the primary Aegis mainframe. I opened the central command terminal. The screen rendered alive. Beating heart of data, the entire operational architecture of Vanguard Logistics. 2 years prior, that heart had flatlined. Vanguard operated on archaic dispatch software built decades ago. Their supply chains suffered chronic, catastrophic bottlenecks. Fuel costs bled their accounts dry. I had analyzed their public financial filings and discovered a terminal diagnosis. The company burned capital at an unsustainable velocity. They stood exactly 6 weeks away from total insolvency. Silas possessed an ego too massive to admit failure. He refused to hire external tech consultants, entirely convinced his outdated methodologies remained superior. I knew approaching him directly with a modernized solution would trigger his fragile pride. He would reject the lifeline out of spite, simply because his designated disappointment offered it. So, I vanished into the code. I locked myself inside my home office for 6 brutal months. I slept in 4-hour intervals. I consumed black coffee and mapped the entire eastern seaboard transit grid. I authored a proprietary data routing algorithm. I wrote tens of thousands of lines of code, integrating real-time weather analytics, weight distribution metrics, and predictive maintenance schedules. The resulting software possessed the capability to predict traffic patterns, optimize fuel consumption, and automate warehouse dispatch with absolute zero-margin error. I established Aegis systems behind a labyrinth of offshore proxies, shielded holding companies, and blinded bank accounts. I approached Vanguard's panicked board of directors through encrypted communication channels. I offered the algorithm alongside a massive emergency capital injection of $4 million. Silas accepted the anonymous lifeline without executing a single shred of due diligence. He heralded Aegis as a corporate miracle. He built his current aristocratic illusion entirely on top of my silent, uncredited labor. I flexed my fingers over the mechanical keyboard. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of the keys shattered the dead quiet of the penthouse. I navigated past the outer firewalls of the Vanguard mainframe. I did not hack them. I simply utilized the backdoor node I had hard-coded into the original algorithm, a dormant failsafe designed precisely for this exact scenario. The Vanguard global dashboard populated my left monitor. Thousands of glowing green dots crawled across a digital map of the United States, representing active delivery fleets, cargo ships, and warehouse manifests. The machinery of my father's wealth operated flawlessly, moving thousands of tons of freight through the winter storm. I opened the administrative command prompt on my right monitor. I accessed the root directory housing the Aegis license keys. I did not pause to consider the collateral damage. I felt no hesitation. Silas and Desmond had actively conspired to draft fraudulent medical affidavits. They attempted to lock me inside a psychiatric cage, to steal my autonomy and seize my assets. Mercy dissolved entirely from my operational parameters. I typed the execution command: revoke all credentials. Execute protocol. Blackout. I struck the enter key. The financial amputation commenced immediately. On the left monitor, the Vanguard operational dashboard shuddered. A cascading wave of system errors flooded the interface. The glowing green dots vanished, systematically replaced by glaring crimson alert triangles. Connection terminated. Routing failed. Manifest offline. System unreachable. I watched the methodical collapse of a logistics empire. Across the country, regional dispatch centers went completely blind. I tracked the localized fallout through terminal readouts. A fleet of 40 trucks leaving a distribution hub in Atlanta stopped dead on the highway shoulders, their drivers staring at blank routing tablets. Cargo loaders in Chicago locked up, rejecting incoming freight. Automated warehouse sorters ground to a violent halt mid-cycle. The digital arteries of Vanguard Logistics severed entirely, halting millions of dollars of inventory in transit. The supply chain froze solid. My family had spent my entire life trying to shrink me into a manageable, obedient shadow. Silas believed he could snap his fingers in a crowded ballroom and strip away my grandfather's trust fund. Desmond believed he could draft a few fraudulent legal documents and trap me in a sterile hospital room. They looked at me and saw a powerless, fragile woman they could manipulate and discard without consequence. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a master system architect. I sat bathed in the cold blue light of the monitors, watching their crimson failures multiply endlessly across the screen. The countdown had ended. The demolition was actively underway. The pale gray light of winter dawn crept over the Boston harbor, piercing the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. I had not slept. I did not require sleep. I sat anchored in the ergonomic chair before the obsidian dining table, bathed in the sharp blue glow of my monitors. On the left screen, the Vanguard Logistics operational map remained a graveyard of crimson alert triangles. Thousands of trucks sat paralyzed on highway shoulders and loading docks across the eastern seaboard. On the right screen, my firewall diagnostic logs cascaded in a relentless vertical stream. Silas and Gideon were attempting a siege. They lacked the technical sophistication to breach the Aegis network personally, so they had marshaled Vanguard's internal technology department. The firewall logs documented a barrage of brute force attacks, aggressive ping sweeps, and desperate packet injections aimed at the core server. They were trying to smash the lock and reclaim the proprietary routing algorithm. I watched the red threat indicators flash and disappear. My security architecture absorbed their attacks without registering a single fraction of structural strain. The Vanguard technicians were hurling rocks at a titanium vault. At precisely 6 a.m, the attack frequency plummeted. The ping requests slowed, sputtered, and ceased entirely. Silas had exhausted his technical avenues. He finally understood that the digital door was permanently sealed. He pivoted immediately to Desmond's strategy. If he could not hack the network, he would hack the narrative. My burner smartphone, resting on the cold stone surface of the table, began to vibrate. The buzzing emitted a harsh, continuous rattle against the obsidian. I did not reach for it. I watched the screen illuminate. The notifications flooded the lock screen in rapid succession. 10 missed calls, 25, 40. The barrage originated from Gideon's number, interwoven with restricted lines. When the calls went to voicemail, the text messages began. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. I scrolled through Gideon's incoming assault. He did not ask about the algorithm. He did not mention the halted trucks. He followed Desmond's legal blueprint with robotic precision, laying the digital groundwork for the conservatorship. Serenity, please answer the phone. We are terrified for your safety. You left the house in a manic state. You are not thinking clearly. Dad found a private facility. Just come back to Beacon Hill. We can get you the psychiatric help you desperately need. Do not do anything destructive. Your mind is playing tricks on you. I read the words, dissecting the manipulation. Gideon did not feel terror or concern. He felt the crushing weight of his unpayable gambling debts closing in as the Vanguard revenue stream dried up. The texts were a performance, manufactured entirely for the benefit of a future probate judge. Desmond had instructed them to create a documented history of familial concern. They needed a paper trail portraying me as a deranged, unstable woman experiencing a severe psychological break. I placed the phone face down. I walked to the kitchenette, retrieved a glass carafe, and prepared a pour-over coffee. I measured the grounds with absolute precision. I poured the boiling water in slow, concentric circles, watching the dark liquid drip through the filter. My breathing remained deep and even. My resting heart rate did not elevate. When I returned to the monitors, The smear campaign had evolved from localized text messages to a synchronized, regional broadcast. I opened a custom web scraping script I had coded years ago. I configured the parameters to monitor my name, Vanguard Logistics, and Aegis systems across Boston's elite social forums, professional networking platforms, and corporate chat channels. I deployed the scraper and watched the data aggregate. Lorraine had entered the battlefield. My mother possessed a singular, terrifying talent, the weaponization of high society gossip. She treated her address book like a loaded firearm. The scraper intercepted a forwarded voice memo circulating through a private group of Beacon Hill socialites. I downloaded the audio file, routed it through my encrypted headset, and pressed play. Lorraine's voice flowed through the speakers, laced with a meticulously calibrated theatrical tremor. "I am just heartbroken, absolutely shattered." Lorraine whispered into the recording, pausing perfectly to execute a stifled sob. Serenity suffered a severe psychotic break at our Christmas gathering. The pressure of her isolated lifestyle finally fractured her mind. She became violent. She is a danger to herself. Silas and Gideon are doing everything they can to secure a medical intervention. But she fled into the city. Please, keep our family in your prayers during this tragedy. I deleted the audio file. The architecture of their lie crystallized completely. The immediate withdrawal of my $4 million and the termination of the Aegis algorithm had plunged Vanguard Logistics into instant insolvency. When the corporate board of directors demanded an explanation for the halted fleets and the drained accounts, Silas could not confess the truth. He could not admit he had built his empire on the anonymous charity of the daughter he chronically abused. He certainly could not admit that Gideon had embezzled the remaining operating capital to feed an underground gambling syndicate. They required a scapegoat. The psychotic break narrative solved every problem. Silas would stand before his board of directors and claim that a deranged, estranged daughter had hacked their systems and sabotaged their infrastructure during a manic episode. He would use Desmond's conservatorship to seize my assets, plug the financial holes, and emerge as the tragic, resilient patriarch who survived a family crisis. My professional network ignited next. A former colleague from my previous data analytics firm left a hesitant, deeply uncomfortable voicemail on my encrypted professional line. "Serenity. This is Mark. Your mother called the managing director this morning. She was crying. She said you are experiencing a mental health emergency and warned us that any data you touch might be compromised. I am not sure what is happening, but human resources flagged your profile. Call me when you can." They were salting the earth. They intended to burn my professional credibility to ash, ensuring that if I attempted to expose their insolvency or Gideon's embezzlement, no authority in Boston would believe me. I would be dismissed as a bitter, unstable woman spinning paranoid delusions. The burner phone rattled against the obsidian again. "Serenity. The police are looking for you for your own good. Turn yourself in before you hurt someone, Gideon." A lesser opponent would have cracked under the suffocating weight of the coordinated attack. A lesser opponent would have logged onto social media, typed a frantic, defensive manifesto, and uploaded it for the world to see. A lesser opponent would have called Lorraine, screaming into the receiver, begging her to stop the relentless flood of lies. I did none of those things. Engaging with a gaslighter provides them with oxygen. Defending yourself against a fabricated accusation validates the premise of the attack. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and took a slow sip of the black coffee. The bitter heat washed over my tongue. I lifted my hands, placed them on the mechanical keyboard, and engaged a strict digital blackout protocol. I severed all incoming connections to my personal lines. I blocked Gideon's number. I blocked Silas. I blocked Lorraine. I routed Desmond's emails directly into an isolated quarantine folder. I erected a wall of absolute, impenetrable silence. I watched the web scraper pull in new threads of gossip. The lies spread through the Boston elite with the speed of a virulent contagion. They built the narrative brick by brick, layering false concern over malicious intent. I let them build it. I did not intervene. I wanted them to construct the tallest, most elaborate tower of deception possible. I wanted Silas to repeat the lie to his board of directors. I wanted Desmond to submit the fraudulent medical claims to the probate judge. I wanted Gideon to stake his remaining freedom on the illusion of my insanity. The fundamental law of structural engineering dictates that the higher a monument rises on a compromised foundation, the more catastrophic the eventual collapse. I sat bathed in the blue light, tracking their digital movements, silently gathering the time-stamped evidence of their extortion. I allowed them to believe they had successfully backed me into a corner, fully aware that the corner they perceived was actually the jaw of a steel trap waiting to snap shut. The primary workstation resting on the obsidian dining table emitted a sharp, high-pitched double chime. The sound sliced through the quiet hum of the penthouse climate control. I shifted my gaze from the Vanguard Logistics firewall logs to the communication terminal. A red priority override notification pulsed in the center of the screen. The sender was Evelyn Hayes, the managing director of Zenith Data Forensics. My spine stiffened against the mesh backing of the ergonomic chair. Zenith stood as the premier data auditing firm on the Eastern Seaboard. We held classified subcontracts with the Department of Defense and monitored the structural integrity of federal banking networks. Corporate risk management within Zenith operated with ruthless, unsentimental efficiency. I checked the timestamp. It was exactly 8 in the morning. The smear campaign orchestrated by Silas and Lorraine had breached my professional perimeter. I knew the corporate protocol. An architect possessing top-tier security clearances cannot become the subject of a public psychological scandal when a liability emerges. The firm severs the connection to protect the core infrastructure. Evelyn was calling to execute the guillotine. I did not panic. I did not draft a frantic defense. I closed the Vanguard monitoring windows, ensuring no proprietary data contaminated the Zenith network. I buttoned my tailored blazer, smoothed my hair into a severe, immaculate knot, and accepted the encrypted video link. The screen flickered, resolving into a crisp, high-definition feed of Evelyn's corner office. She sat behind a sprawling glass desk. She wore a charcoal suit, her expression completely devoid of warmth. She did not offer a polite morning greeting. She bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries entirely. "Serenity," Evelyn stated, her voice projecting a stark, surgical authority. She tapped a key on her terminal. "I am sharing a raw data file to your secure local drive. Open it." A file materialized on my desktop. I bypassed the standard virus scan, trusting the Zenith encryption, and expanded the document. The window populated with a sprawling spreadsheet containing hundreds of logged communication attempts targeting Zenith's Human Resources Department. Between midnight and dawn, our internal servers intercepted 74 anonymous tips regarding your mental stability, Evelyn explained, her eyes tracking my reaction through the webcam. The messages claim you suffered a violent psychotic break. They warn that any federal architecture you currently manage is severely compromised by your supposed manic state. I kept my features locked in a mask of absolute detachment. The volume of their assault was staggering. Silas and Gideon had not merely planted seeds of doubt. They had deployed an industrial-scale disinformation campaign to obliterate my livelihood. "Evelyn, I understand the implications for the firm," I replied. Keeping my tone perfectly measured, I refused to let my voice waver. "I will not contest an administrative leave. I can submit my formal resignation before 9 o'clock to ensure Zenith remains insulated from this fabricated fallout." Evelyn stopped typing. She leaned forward, resting her forearms against the glass desk. The harsh, surgical detachment in her eyes shifted into something sharper, something predatory. "Do not insult my intelligence by offering a resignation," Evelyn commanded. She pointed a finger toward the webcam lens. "Scroll to column F on that spreadsheet. Look at the routing data." I moved the cursor across the screen. I expanded the column containing the origin points of the anonymous tips. The individuals executing this campaign attempted to bounce their internet protocol addresses through a series of commercial proxies, Evelyn continued, a dry, humorless smirk touching the corner of her mouth. They utilized off-the-shelf privacy software. It took our cybersecurity division exactly 12 minutes to dismantle their obfuscation. I read the decrypted origin coordinates. The data did not lie. 32 of those emails originated from the residential router installed inside your father's Beacon Hill mansion, Evelyn stated, reading from her own monitor. The remaining 42 calls and messages traced directly back to the executive suites at Vanguard Logistics headquarters. I stared at the numbers. Gideon had been incredibly, catastrophically sloppy. He assumed standard encryption would shield him from an elite forensic data firm. He brought a plastic knife to a gunfight. "We secure sovereign infrastructure, serenity," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register of absolute certainty. "We hunt down international syndicates. We do not terminate our lead architects because a failing logistics company decides to throw a digital tantrum. We know exactly what competence looks like, and we know exactly what a desperate smear campaign looks like." The tight, coiled tension in my chest unspooled. I sat in the quiet penthouse, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. Silas shared my bloodline, yet he actively conspired to lock me inside a psychiatric ward to steal $4 million. Evelyn shared nothing but a payroll ledger with me, yet she offered a fortress of unshakable professional loyalty. She evaluated me entirely on the merit of my intellect, discarding the toxic narrative my family attempted to impose. "Your clearance remains active," Evelyn confirmed. She reached for her mouse to terminate the connection, but she paused, locking eyes with me through the digital feed one final time. "Finish them," she ordered. The video feed cut to black. The silence rushed back into the penthouse, but the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. I was no longer a designated disappointment hiding from a toxic dynasty. I was no longer a ghost architect anonymously bailing out incompetent men. I was a fully authorized, heavily armed forensic auditor. I pushed my chair back from the obsidian table. I walked to the kitchenette, poured the remaining black coffee down the stainless steel drain, and retrieved a fresh bottle of mineral water. I needed absolute, crystalline focus. I returned to the workstation and closed the defensive firewall logs. I did not care about blocking their attacks anymore. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. I opened a series of blank, black command terminals. If Gideon possessed the sheer desperation required to forge medical affidavits and launch mass defamation campaigns, his financial reality had to be apocalyptic. The termination of the Aegis algorithm halted their trucks. But the true rot lived in their ledgers. I needed to uncover the exact mechanics of his embezzlement. I deployed a specialized packet sniffer, routing it through the backdoor node I maintained inside the Vanguard mainframe. I instructed the software to bypass the logistics dashboard and tunnel directly into the corporate accounting sector. My fingers struck the mechanical keyboard in rapid, unbroken rhythms. I wrote a custom scraping sequence designed to extract 2 years of outgoing wire transfers. I set the parameters to flag any transaction exceeding $10,000 that lacked a corresponding vendor invoice. The terminal screen blinked. The algorithm processed the request. Lines of financial data began unspooling across the monitor. I watched the numbers cascade downward. Gideon had not merely skimmed cash from the operating accounts. He had orchestrated a sustained, aggressive hemorrhage of corporate capital. I isolated the flagged transactions. The destination routing numbers did not match any legitimate diesel suppliers, fleet maintenance contractors, or warehouse leases. The funds flowed outward and clean, round numbers $50,000, $100,000, $200,000, all directed toward a cluster of holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. He was feeding a massive underground gambling syndicate, washing the stolen logistics revenue through offshore shell entities. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I extracted the offshore routing codes and launched a deep web tracer to map the ultimate destination of the stolen capital. I was no longer just protecting my assets from a conservatorship. I was actively hunting their digital footprints, gathering the raw, radioactive material required to burn their hollow aristocracy to the ground. The trap was armed. I only needed to wait for them to step onto the pressure plate. The burner phone vibrated against the obsidian table. The screen illuminated, displaying a restricted caller identification. I traced the edge of the device with my index finger, considering the risk. Silas and Gideon relied on brute force, not encrypted channels. I pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not speak. Serenity. The voice trembled, barely rising above a frantic whisper. Ambient noise bled through the connection, the faint, rhythmic clatter of computer keyboards, the rustle of turning pages, the hushed murmur of a public space. Daphne, I answered. I am at the public library in Cambridge. She breathed, the panic evident in the erratic cadence of her words. I left my cell phone at the estate. Gideon thinks I am attending a yoga class. I have exactly 90 minutes before he expects me back. We need to meet. Give me an address. She provided the location of an obscure, independent coffee shop nestled deep in the residential blocks of Somerville. I terminated the call, shut down the external monitors, and engaged the physical locks on my suite. I drove across the Charles River, the tires of my sedan crushing the fresh layers of snow packing the asphalt. The coffee shop sat on a quiet corner, its windows clouded with heavy condensation. The air inside smelled of roasted beans and wet wool. I selected a booth in the far back, facing the entrance, and ordered a black espresso. Daphne arrived 15 minutes later. She lacked the polished, flawless aesthetic she maintained at Vanguard corporate dinners. She wore a heavy, unbranded parka. She had scrubbed her face clean of makeup, revealing the stark, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes. She scanned the room with rapid, erratic movements before spotting me in the shadows. She slid into the booth opposite me. Her hands shook as she unzipped her pockets. She did not order a drink. She did not offer a polite greeting. She reached into the depths of her coat and retrieved a small, metallic rectangle. She slid an encrypted USB drive across the scarred wooden table. I placed my hand flat over the drive, securing it. I met her gaze. "He breaks things," Daphne whispered, her eyes darting toward the frosted windows. "He punches the walls. He shatters plates. He screams until the veins in his neck bulge. And then he goes to the office and pretends to be a titan. He's been unraveling for 2 years. Serenity. I have been planning my escape for 18 months. I remained silent, allowing her to release the pressure building inside her chest. "He leaves his laptop unlocked when he passes out from the bourbon," Daphne continued, wrapping her trembling fingers around her own elbows. "I bought mirroring software every night while he slept. I duplicated his local drive. I wanted leverage for a divorce. I wanted an insurance policy to ensure he could not destroy me the way he destroys everything else." "What did you find?" "Daphne." She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a lethal, hollow pitch. "He is not just an incompetent vice president. He is a thief. He loses hundreds of thousands of dollars on underground sports betting. The bookies started calling his private line, threatening physical violence. He panicked. He started writing fake vendor invoices to cover the margins." I pulled my shielded tablet from my satchel. I activated the offline operating system, ensuring no network connections compromised the data. I inserted the USB drive into the port. "He embezzled the operating capital," Daphne confirmed. Watching the tablet screen flare to life. "He funneled the cash through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He thought he could outsmart the syndicates, but he just dug a deeper grave." The root directory populated on my screen. I expanded the primary folder. Daphne had captured a comprehensive, devastating archive. I scrolled through nested spreadsheets detailing fake consulting fees, fabricated diesel fuel invoices, and ghost warehouse leases. I opened a folder containing exported email drafts. Gideon had communicated directly with the offshore proxies, leaving an undeniable, time-stamped trail of wire fraud and international money laundering. The data matched the offshore routing codes I had isolated in the penthouse exactly. It was not just a breach of fiduciary duty. It constituted a staggering volume of federal crimes. If submitted to a federal prosecutor, this drive guaranteed a decade-long prison sentence. "I saw your portfolio on the credenza," Daphne stated, her voice steadying as she watched me process the evidence. I handed it to Silas. "I watched his empire collapse on that marble floor. I knew it was you. I knew you possessed the capability to burn them to the ground." I looked up from the glowing screen. "Why bring this to me?" "Because Desmond drafted a conservatorship," Daphne replied, her jaw tightening. "I heard Silas bragging about it this morning. They plan to declare you insane, lock you in a facility, and steal the Aegis infrastructure. I refuse to let them trap another woman in their cage. I want them ruined. Serenity. I want Gideon in federal custody, and I want to disappear. A quiet, lethal alliance solidified in the space between us. We shared no blood, but we shared the exact same enemy. We were both survivors of the same toxic, aristocratic illusion. You cannot return to Beacon Hill, I instructed, closing the encrypted files on my tablet. If Gideon discovers you mirrored his drive, the violence will escalate. The financial hemorrhage at Vanguard will push him over the edge today. He will be looking for a target. I know, Daphne whispered. A tear finally escaped, cutting a clean path down her cheek. But my accounts are monitored. If I purchase a flight, he will track the transaction before I reach the security checkpoint. I have nothing. You have this, I corrected, tapping the metal casing of the USB drive. You brought me the execution order. That possesses immense value. I disconnected the USB drive and secured it inside a shielded Faraday pouch in my satchel. I reopened the tablet, bypassing the offline mode, and connected to my secure offshore banking portal. I navigated through a labyrinth of shells corporations I had established during the creation of Aegis systems. I possess liquid assets completely detached from my domestic identity. I opened a new transfer window. I did not ask for her routing number. A standard bank transfer left a digital footprint Gideon's lawyers could eventually subpoena. Instead, I generated a secure, anonymous cryptocurrency wallet. I transferred a massive sum enough to purchase a home, secure private legal counsel, and live comfortably for a decade directly into the decentralized ledger. I wrote a 12-word recovery phrase on a small piece of heavy cardstock. I slid the paper across the scarred wooden table. Memorize this phrase, and then burn the paper, I commanded, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable authority. Access the wallet using a public terminal. The funds are entirely untraceable. Go to the airport, purchase a ticket with cash, and fly to California. Change your number. Do not contact anyone in Boston. Daphne stared at the 12 words. Her chest heaved. The sheer magnitude of her sudden freedom overwhelmed her nervous system. She reached across the table and grasped my hand. Her grip was desperate and fiercely grateful. Thank you, she choked out, her voice fracturing. Do not thank me, I replied, withdrawing my hand gently. Survive. That is the only return on investment I require. She nodded, swiping the tears from her face with the back of her sleeve. She memorized the cardstock. Striking a match from a small booklet on the table, we watched the paper curl into black ash. Dropping the remnants into an empty ceramic saucer, Daphne stood up, pulled the heavy parka tight around her shoulders, and walked out the door into the driving snow. I remained in the booth, sipping the cold, bitter espresso. I stared at the frosted window panes. My father and my brother believed they operated from a position of absolute power. They assumed their titles and their suits shielded them from consequences. They believed they could forge medical documents and steal millions of dollars without resistance. I patted the satchel resting beside me. The USB drive felt heavy. It contained the raw, radioactive material required to trigger a federal indictment. Daphne had handed me the final, irrefutable pieces of the puzzle. I possessed the bank logs. I possessed the emails. I possessed the offshore routing hashes. I paid for the coffee in cash and walked out into the winter storm. The cold air filled my lungs. I was no longer merely defending my assets. I possessed the weapon required to obliterate Vanguard logistics and send its hollow aristocrats to federal prison. The trap was fully armed, the bait was set, and I was entirely prepared to execute the final sequence. I returned to the secure, climate-controlled corridors of Zenith Data Forensics. The biometric scanners recognized my retinal pattern. Parting the heavy glass doors to my sector, the ambient hum of the server arrays provided a familiar, grounding frequency. I bypassed the communal break areas and walked directly into my private office. My assistant, a sharp-eyed junior analyst, stood near my desk. She held a thick, oversized envelope constructed from premium, heavyweight paper. A bonded courier slip rested on top. "This arrived via priority messenger 10 minutes ago," she stated, extending the package. The courier demanded a direct signature. I secured it under your proxy authorization. I took the envelope. My thumb traced the embossed, silver foil emblem stamped across the top left corner. The insignia belonged to Desmond's employer, a ruthless, top-tier corporate law firm located in the financial district. "Thank you," I replied, dismissing her with a brief nod. The heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing me inside my office. I walked behind my desk and retrieved a steel letter opener. I sliced the envelope open, extracting a stack of legal documents bound by a brass staple. The header glared in bold: aggressive typography, formal cease and desist, imminent breach of fiduciary duty, and intent to seek emergency injunction. I sat in my ergonomic chair, spreading the pages across the smooth surface of my desk. I read Desmond's prose. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, engineered specifically to terrorize a civilian into immediate submission. Desmond weaponized complex terminology, building a labyrinth of threats designed to simulate an inescapable trap. He cited the immediate withdrawal of the $4 million and the termination of the Aegis algorithm, claiming these actions constituted a malicious breach of corporate fiduciary duty. He wrote that Vanguard Logistics faced catastrophic, irreparable harm. He demanded the immediate reinstatement of the routing software and the reversal of the capital extraction. Then, he deployed the nuclear option. The final page outlined the impending conservatorship. Desmond referenced a sworn medical affidavit, signed by Silas and Lorraine, attesting to my severe psychological instability. He threatened to submit the affidavit to the probate court by the end of the business day. He promised to secure an emergency freeze on every bank account tied to my Social Security number, stripping my financial autonomy entirely until I submitted to a state-mandated psychiatric evaluation. A normal person would read those paragraphs and experience a paralyzing panic attack. A normal person would dial the firm's number, begging for a negotiation, desperate to avoid the terrifying machinery of the probate court. I did not flinch. My pulse maintained a steady, resting rhythm. I understood the law vastly better than Desmond comprehended data architecture, and Desmond had fundamentally miscalculated his legal standing. Aegis Systems operated as an independent, third-party vendor. I held no board seat at Vanguard Logistics. I signed no non-compete clauses. I bore zero fiduciary responsibility to my father's crumbling empire. The 30-day termination clause embedded in the original contract authorized my actions completely. His claims of fiduciary breach were entirely fabricated, constructed of smoke and mirrors. Furthermore, the medical affidavit constituted textbook perjury. Silas and Lorraine lacked a single shred of clinical evidence. Submitting it to a judge exposed them to severe criminal liability. Desmond was bluffing. He possessed an empty hand, betting everything on the assumption that I would fold under the psychological pressure of a legal letterhead. I gathered the crisp, premium pages. I stood up and walked to the corner of my office. An industrial crosscut shredder rested beside the filing cabinets. I switched the machine on. The steel blades whirred to life. I fed the cease and desist directly into the intake slot. The heavy paper vanished, pulled downward by the interlocking gears. The machine ground Desmond's masterpiece into thousands of illegible, useless paper ribbons. I watched the confetti fall into the transparent bin. I returned to my workstation. I unlocked my terminal and navigated to the isolated quarantine folder in my email client. Desmond had transmitted a digital copy of the demand letter concurrently with the physical courier. I opened his email. I did not draft a defensive, rambling rebuttal. I did not attempt to argue the merits of the law or beg him to reconsider the conservatorship. Explanations validate the extorter. I hit the reply button. My fingers struck the mechanical keys, producing a rapid, sharp rhythm. I typed a single sentence. I do not negotiate with corporate parasites. I pressed send. The message vanished, rocketing through the encrypted servers directly into Desmond's inbox. I did not close the terminal. Shredding a demand letter offered personal satisfaction, but I required total tactical neutralization. Desmond had crossed a terminal boundary. He leveraged his legal credentials to facilitate an extortion scheme against me, exchanging my freedom for Silas's promise of a partnership recommendation. I initiated a metadata extraction protocol on the digital file Desmond had emailed. The forensic software ripped the PDF apart, exposing the underlying digital footprint, the author tags, creation timestamps, and routing hashes populated my screen. Desmond drafted the document at 2 in the morning, utilizing his firm-issued laptop. He transmitted the file through the firm's secure virtual private network. He made a catastrophic, arrogant error. Top-tier corporate law firms operate on strict, unforgiving compliance structures. Every client requires formal intake. Every minute requires a billable code. Every action taken on the firm's letterhead exposes the managing partners to massive liability. Vanguard Logistics did not retain Desmond's firm for family law or probate litigation. Desmond bypassed the intake committee entirely. He utilized the firm's official letterhead, their courier accounts, and their digital infrastructure to conduct unbilled, off-the-books legal extortion for his own personal gain. He weaponized their reputation to secure a bribe from Silas. I compiled the extracted metadata. I merged the digital footprint of the demand letter with the audio logs I had intercepted from his home office network, the exact timestamps correlating to his midnight phone call with Silas, where they explicitly negotiated the fraudulent conservatorship in exchange for the partnership recommendation. I drafted a new, highly encrypted email. I did not use my personal address. I routed the message through an untraceable, offshore proxy server. I addressed the email directly to the 3 senior managing partners of Desmond's firm, copying the Internal Ethics and Compliance Committee. I attached the metadata report. I attached the forged cease and desist letter. In the body of the email, I wrote a clinical, objective summary of the violation to the managing partners. Please find attached documented evidence of a senior associate utilizing firm resources, network infrastructure, and official letterhead to conduct unbilled, unsanctioned legal extortion. The associate is currently conspiring to file fraudulent medical affidavits in probate court to secure a personal partnership recommendation from a third party. This constitutes severe malpractice and exposes your institution to immediate, catastrophic liability. I hovered the cursor over the execution command. Desmond believed he held the power to lock me in a cage. He believed his tailored suits and his aggressive vocabulary rendered him untouchable. He assumed the daughter of Silas lacked the spine to strike back. I clicked send. The encrypted packet deployed. It bypassed Desmond entirely, landing directly on the monitors of the men who controlled his entire professional existence. I closed the terminal windows. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair. I felt no remorse. I felt no lingering attachment to the man I had planned to marry. Desmond had placed his chips on the wrong side of the board. The managing partners would review the irrefutable metadata. They would recognize the massive ethical breach and the threat to their corporate standing. By the end of the business day, Desmond would no longer possess an office, a career, or a law license. The extortion attempt was officially neutralized, and the traitor was permanently excised from my life. The days marching toward January 1st possessed a grim, relentless velocity. The financial hemorrhage bleeding Vanguard Logistics dry accelerated with every hour the trucks sat paralyzed. Silas and Gideon stared down the barrel of total corporate ruin. My $4 million sat locked behind the Aegis firewalls, scheduled for immediate extraction. Desmond's fraudulent conservatorship lay shredded in a waste bin. The traitor permanently neutralized. My father and brother exhausted their legal avenues. They exhausted their internal technology department. Desperation breeds severe miscalculation. I sat anchored in the penthouse, wrapped in the absolute silence of the midnight hours. Snow lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The obsidian table anchored my command center. A sharp, synchronized dual-tone alarm shattered the quiet. The primary monitor flared, washing the room in a harsh, pulsing crimson light. The threat detection software I hard-coded into the Aegis mainframe triggered a Priority 1 alert. I placed my glass of mineral water onto the stone surface. I pulled my keyboard forward. This breach attempt did not resemble the clumsy, amateur ping sweeps executed by Vanguard's internal staff days prior. This attack carried the unmistakable signature of professional mercenaries. Lines of malicious code cascaded across my diagnostic terminal. The attackers utilized a coordinated multi-vector assault. They deployed credential stuffing algorithms, aggressively cycling through thousands of cryptographic hashes per second. They launched a distributed denial-of-service protocol against the outer firewall, attempting to blind my security sensors while a secondary script probed for structural weaknesses in the server architecture. Silas and Gideon had cracked open the remaining Vanguard treasury. They hired black hat contractors to break the lock. They intended to hijack the Aegis root directory, forge my digital authorizations, and reverse the extraction of the $4 million. They wanted to steal the proprietary routing software backed by sheer digital force. My fingers struck the mechanical keys. The sharp, rapid clatter filled the room. Standard cybersecurity doctrine dictates an immediate, aggressive block. An administrator identifies the hostile routing protocols, severs the connection, and fortifies the breached ports. I discarded standard doctrine. Blocking the mercenaries merely forces them to retreat, regroup, and attack a different vulnerability. It teaches the enemy your defensive capabilities. I decided to invite them inside. I initiated a honeypot protocol. I partitioned a section of my local server array, isolating it completely from the genuine Aegis mainframe. I erected a virtual machine, a digital sandbox. I populated this quarantine zone with mirrored directories, dummy configuration files, and replicated database structures. It looked, reacted, and functioned exactly like the authentic Aegis command center. It possessed the exact file architecture, holding the logistics algorithm and the capital withdrawal mandates. It was a flawless replica, built entirely on dead air. I navigated to the perimeter firewall controls. I located the specific port bearing the heaviest concentration of the mercenary assault. I dropped the shield. The crimson threat indicators flared, signaling a successful penetration. The black hat contractors poured through the opening, flooding into the internal network. They believed they had shattered the titanium vault. They believed they had outsmarted a master architect. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair. I steepled my fingers, watching the secondary monitor track their movements. The sandbox environment functioned like a two-way mirror. The mercenaries saw the simulated Aegis directories. I saw every single keystroke they executed. I deployed a deep packet inspection protocol. The software stripped away the layers of commercial proxy servers and virtual private networks the contractors utilized to mask their origin. I watched the decryption algorithm chew through their obfuscation. The raw, unprotected Internet Protocol addresses populated my screen. The routing data split into two distinct geographic locations. The attack originated from an offshore server farm in Eastern Europe. The command and control node directing the attack traced directly back to the executive suites at Vanguard Logistics headquarters in Boston. Gideon sat at his desk, actively communicating with the mercenaries, watching the breach unfold. On the primary monitor, the intruders navigated the dummy directories. Their cursor movements appeared frantic, driven by the ticking clock of the impending January 1st deadline. They bypassed the routing algorithm entirely. They possessed zero interest in restoring the stalled delivery trucks. They hunted the money. The contractors located the simulated financial directory. They targeted the withdrawal authorization ledger holding the $4 million. I activated a screen capture sequence, recording the event in high-definition video while simultaneously logging the network traffic. The mercenaries initiated a file upload protocol. The progress bar materialized on my screen, filling rapidly from left to right. They injected a payload into the sandbox. I intercepted the transmission, opening the file in a quarantined viewer. It was a master transfer of ownership document. The text mandated the immediate, irrevocable transfer of all Aegis Systems proprietary assets, including the core algorithm and the $4 million in liquid capital, directly into Vanguard's primary corporate holding accounts. I scrolled to the bottom of the document. A digital signature rested on the final line. It was a flawless, pixel-perfect replication of my own handwriting. Gideon and Silas had provided the mercenaries with historical family documents. They supplied the black hat contractors with my signature, authorizing them to forge a legal transfer of wealth. They intended to bypass the withdrawal mandate, steal the $4 million, and lock me out of my own company. They crossed the Rubicon. Silas and Gideon graduated from verbal abuse and corporate incompetence into irrefutable federal criminality. They committed aggravated identity theft. They executed wire fraud across international borders. They utilized an electronic communications network to conduct a massive cyber heist. The contractors executed the final command script, attempting to finalize the forged transfer. They believed they had secured the objective. They believed the $4 million belonged to Vanguard. I placed my hands back on the keyboard. I isolated the captured data packets. I secured the video recordings, the raw IP logs, and the forged transfer documents. I locked the evidence behind military-grade encryption. Then, I executed the termination sequence. I severed the port connection. I collapsed the virtual machine. The sandbox environment disintegrated instantly, evaporating into lines of dead code. On the other side of the connection, the mercenaries stared at blank screens. Their access vanished. The files they thought they secured dissolved. They captured absolutely nothing. I sat in the glow of the monitors. The silence returned to the penthouse, absolute and unbroken. I compiled the raw data logs. I organized the timestamps, the unmasked routing codes connecting the Eastern European server farm to the Vanguard executive suites, and the forged ownership transfers. I structured the information with clinical precision, building a comprehensive chronological narrative of their cyber assault. I sealed the data inside a highly classified execution dossier. My father and my brother attempted to weaponize brute force to steal my empire. Instead, they walked blindly into a meticulously constructed digital snare. They handed me the exact, undeniable proof required to trigger a federal indictment. I possessed the bank logs. I possessed the forged signatures. I possessed the unmasked network traffic, tying the entire conspiracy directly to Gideon's desktop computer. The trap was fully armed, the steel jaws locked securely into place as the January 1st deadline dawned over the freezing Boston skyline. Silas and Gideon stood entirely defenseless against the catastrophic financial hemorrhage they created, entirely unaware that their desperate hacking attempt had just guaranteed their permanent relocation to a federal penitentiary. The digital clock on my terminal clicked over to midnight. January 1st arrived. I sat in the darkness of the penthouse, the blue light of the monitors casting sharp shadows against the obsidian table. I did not hesitate. I did not pause to consider the weight of the moment. I placed my hands on the mechanical keyboard and executed the withdrawal protocol. The progress bar materialized, filling from left to right in a smooth, unbroken sequence. $4 million vanished from the Vanguard Logistics corporate escrow. The capital siphoned through a labyrinth of decentralized nodes, washing through international proxies before pooling securely inside my untraceable offshore ledger. The Vanguard balance dropped to absolute zero. I initiated the secondary command. The Aegis routing algorithm did not simply power down, it cannibalized its own architecture. The code scrubbed its functional directories from the Vanguard mainframes, overwriting the proprietary logic with dead, fragmented data. The digital nervous system of my father's empire evaporated. Dawn broke over the freezing Boston harbor. The physical manifestation of my keystrokes swept across the eastern seaboard. Logistics networks rely on a flawless, unbroken rhythm. I severed their metronome, 800 miles away. An 18-wheeler hauling perishable pharmaceuticals merged onto the interstate. Inside the cab, the proprietary routing dashboard flickered violently and died. The GPS coordinates vanished. The manifest wiped clean. The driver steered the massive vehicle onto the frozen highway shoulder, pulling the air brakes with a sharp, synchronized hiss. In a massive distribution hub outside Philadelphia, the automated sorting belts ground to a violent halt. Cargo loaders stared at blank scanning terminals. The inventory software crashed, locking thousands of pallets in a digital blackout. Delivery fleets stalled at the loading docks, their engines idling, awaiting dispatch commands that would never arrive. The supply chain froze solid. Inside the executive suites at Vanguard headquarters, the morning commenced with absolute chaos. I monitored their internal communications via my secured backdoor node. The multi-line consoles on Silas's desk erupted. The flashing red indicators illuminated the office in a panicked, continuous strobe. Executives from massive retail conglomerates and pharmaceutical distributors demanded immediate answers. Their cargo sat stranded. Their shelves remained empty. Silas slammed his office door shut. He dragged air into his lungs, his chest heaving under his bespoke suit. He barked orders into his phone, demanding the chief technology officer fix the outage. The CTO entered the executive suite 10 minutes later, his hands trembling. He held a blank diagnostic tablet. He did not offer solutions. He informed Silas that the core architecture was completely gone. The Aegis servers rejected their credentials. The routing code no longer existed on their hardware. Gideon paced the length of the Persian rug, chewing his thumbnail to the quick. The financial reality of the severed algorithm crashed over him. Without the $4 million in operating capital, Vanguard could not process payroll. They could not purchase diesel fuel. They could not service their massive commercial loans. More importantly for Gideon, he could not pay the offshore gambling syndicates. The illegal pipeline he relied on to wash his embezzled funds ran entirely dry. The bookies would stop making phone calls and start making physical visits. Silas stared at the dead monitors on his desk. The aristocratic facade cracked, revealing the terrified, incompetent man underneath. Vanguard breached its loan covenants the moment the $4 million vanished. By the end of the week, commercial creditors would file involuntary bankruptcy petitions. The banks would seize the Beacon Hill mansion. The courts would liquidate the luxury vehicles, the stock portfolios, and the remaining assets. Silas faced total, inescapable personal ruin. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swung open. Desmond stepped across the threshold. He no longer wore the immaculate, tailored suits provided by his former law firm. The senior managing partners had reviewed my metadata dossier, terminated his employment immediately, and forwarded his extortion attempts to the State Bar Association. He lost his prestige, his corner office, and his future. But parasites invariably find new hosts. Silas had hired Desmond directly as in-house legal counsel. Silas offered him a substantial percentage of any salvaged capital if Desmond could construct a legal shield against the impending collapse. Desmond, functioning as a cornered animal, accepted the desperate alliance. He needed a massive financial victory to secure his own survival outside the legitimate legal establishment. Silas slammed his hands flat against his desk, outlining the catastrophic reality. They possessed no routing software. They possessed zero liquid capital. They could not repair the code. They could not survive the week on their remaining cash flow. Silas pivoted to his final, desperate strategy. They needed to sell the corpse of Vanguard Logistics before the industry realized it lacked a pulse. Silas targeted Apex Global. Apex Global operated as a massive, multinational tech conglomerate aggressively seeking to expand its physical logistics division. They possessed bottomless capital reserves and a reputation for rapid, aggressive corporate acquisitions. Silas instructed Desmond and Gideon to draft an emergency buyout proposal. He demanded a $50 million acquisition. The three men transformed the executive suite into a fraudulent war room. They realized no legitimate buyer would acquire a logistics firm lacking functional routing software and missing $4 million in liquid capital. They needed to camouflage the rot. Desmond worked feverishly, typing on his laptop. He abandoned all remaining ethical boundaries. He drafted doctored financial disclosures. He reclassified Gideon's offshore embezzlement as capital depreciation and aggressive asset reallocation. He scrubbed the missing $4 million from the liabilities ledger, spreading the deficit across fabricated vendor accounts. Gideon falsified the technology licenses. He created dummy documents claiming Vanguard fully owned and operated the Aegis software, hiding the fact that the code had completely evaporated. They packaged the proposal as a turnkey operational takeover. They masked their sheer desperation behind a veneer of aristocratic arrogance, presenting the sale as a rare, time-sensitive opportunity for Apex Global to dominate the eastern seaboard. Silas stood behind Desmond, watching the progress bar complete the final document compilation. He poured a heavy measure of scotch into a fresh crystal tumbler. He handed a glass to Gideon and offered a curt nod to Desmond. Silas hit the send button. The $50 million buyout request transmitted across the web, rocketing toward the Apex Global servers. Silas exhaled a long, shuddering breath. A victorious smile stretched across his face, erasing the panic of the morning. He clinked his glass against Gideon's. He believed he had engineered a masterstroke. He believed the $50 million would wipe out the commercial debt, silence Gideon's violent creditors, and secure his own lavish retirement. He viewed the fraudulent proposal as his golden parachute. He thought he had successfully escaped the consequences of his actions, leaving me behind as a discarded, irrelevant casualty of his ambition. From the quiet, cold expanse of my penthouse, I intercepted the outgoing transmission through the Vanguard network nodes. I watched the encrypted packet leave their servers. Silas failed to comprehend the corporate hierarchy of the technology sector. He failed to run a basic personnel check on the conglomerate he sought to defraud. He had absolutely no idea that submitting a $50 million acquisition proposal to the apex of the tech industry routed the documents directly onto my desk. The encrypted communication portal on my primary monitor emitted a sharp, singular chime. A green priority notification pulsed in the upper right quadrant of the screen. I shifted my gaze from the Vanguard Logistics failure logs to the secure inbox. The sender address bore the domain of Apex Global. As a senior forensic data architect for Zenith Data Forensics, I functioned as the lead external auditor for Apex Global's Mergers and Acquisitions division. Apex operated as a publicly traded, multinational conglomerate. They consumed smaller companies with relentless efficiency. Corporate compliance mandated that any acquisition exceeding $20 million required my explicit, unredacted authorization before the executive board released a single cent of capital. Silas submitted a $50 million acquisition proposal. He believed he transmitted his fraudulent documents to a faceless team of gullible tech executives. He believed his tailored suit and his aristocratic posturing shielded his desperation. He had absolutely no idea that his $50 million lifeline routed directly into my secure quarantine server. I clicked the notification. The buyout package downloaded into an isolated sandbox environment. I opened the pitch deck. Silas spared no expense on the graphic design. He utilized sleek, aggressive typography and high-resolution images of immaculate delivery fleets. The cover letter dripped with hubris. He demanded a rapid, expedited closing process, citing an unprecedented market opportunity. He pitched a turnkey operational takeover, assuring Apex Global that Vanguard possessed flawless infrastructure and bottomless growth potential. I bypassed the marketing camouflage. I extracted the raw financial attachments. Desmond had provided the accounting. I aligned the submitted corporate balance sheets on my left monitor. I opened the decrypted contents of Daphne's mirrored USB drive on my right monitor. The cross-reference illuminated a masterpiece of sheer, unadulterated desperation. I scrolled through the fabricated ledgers, line by line. Desmond possessed a competent legal mind, but he lacked rigorous forensic financial training. He attempted to conceal the missing $4 million by inflating dormant vendor accounts. He logged non-existent fuel purchases, phantom warehouse leases, and fabricated maintenance schedules. He reclassified Gideon's systematic embezzlement as aggressive capital depreciation and fleet modernization. I leaned forward, my fingers resting lightly on the mechanical keyboard. Submitting falsified internal ledgers constitutes severe corporate malfeasance. Submitting falsified federal documents elevates the crime to a catastrophic federal felony. I isolated the tax returns Desmond appended to the buyout proposal. Desmond manipulated the gross revenue figures to mask the sudden insolvency. He forged the Internal Revenue Service watermarks, pasting them over doctored income statements. I ran a cryptographic hash check on the submitted PDF files. I examined the compression artifacts and the vector layers within the document structure. The metadata revealed Desmond generated the files mere hours ago, utilizing unauthorized editing software on a local machine. He actively conspired to defraud a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded conglomerate. Securing capital under these pretenses violated strict securities and exchange commission regulations. Defrauding Apex Global triggered severe, immediate regulatory intervention. I shifted my focus to Gideon. Desmond's tax fraud provided the rope, but Gideon's offshore gambling debt provided the anvil. I extracted the routing numbers Daphne had captured from Gideon's personal laptop. I engaged a secure, encrypted tunnel, bridging my local server array with shared international law enforcement databases. I queried the Cayman Islands holding companies Gideon utilized to wash the stolen Vanguard operating capital. The terminal screen blinked, the background color inverted. A cascade of crimson alert banners populated the monitor. The holding companies did not operate as simple, insulated tax havens. They functioned as primary laundering arteries for a massive, underground sports betting syndicate based in Eastern Europe. International policing agencies actively monitored these exact financial nodes. The screen displayed active Interpol red notices attached to the specific holding companies Gideon frequented. Gideon had not merely lost money on football games. He funneled corporate capital directly into a radioactive, heavily surveilled criminal enterprise. By submitting these ledgers to Apex Global, Silas and Desmond unknowingly attempted to inject illicit, cartel-linked capital into the pristine financial ecosystem of a publicly traded tech giant. Apex Global maintained rigorous anti-money laundering protocols. If they absorbed Vanguard, the federal government would freeze Apex's assets pending a massive criminal probe. The magnitude of their hubris solidified my resolve. I did not experience a spike in adrenaline. I operated with the cold, rhythmic precision of a surgeon amputating a necrotic limb. I opened a fresh, encrypted master file. I titled it the Final Execution Dossier. I structured the intelligence package into 3 devastating, airtight sections. First, I attached the raw server logs capturing the mercenary hacking attempt from the previous night. I included the unmasked Internet Protocol addresses, tracing the cyber assault directly to Vanguard headquarters, proving their malicious intent to steal the Aegis infrastructure. Second, I embedded the side-by-side comparisons of Desmond's forged federal tax returns against Daphne's raw embezzlement data. I highlighted the exact financial discrepancies down to the final decimal point, demonstrating the premeditated manipulation of the balance sheets. I included the metadata proving Desmond authored the forgeries. Third, I imported the Interpol red notices and the offshore routing hashes. I constructed a visual data map, linking Gideon's financial pipeline directly to the Eastern European International Syndicate. The chart traced the flow of Vanguard capital straight into the pockets of monitored cartel operatives. I formatted the summary page with the official Zenith Data Forensics letterhead. I rendered the dossier completely impenetrable, stripping away any possibility of plausible deniability. Silas could not charm his way out of cryptographic hashes. Desmond could not litigate away Interpol red notices. Gideon could not throw a tantrum to erase server logs. I secured the file behind a rotating cryptographic lock and uploaded it to the Apex Global Secure Executive Portal, flagging it for the final acquisition meeting. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, rolling my shoulders to release the tension. The digital storm outside the penthouse mirrored the quiet, impending devastation I had just engineered. Miles away in Beacon Hill, Silas paced his executive suite, clutching a glass of scotch, believing he had successfully secured a golden parachute. Desmond polished his resume, anticipating a lucrative corporate payout and a senior partnership elsewhere. Gideon breathed a heavy sigh of relief, assuming the incoming $50 million would finally silence the bookies threatening his life. They scheduled the final, in-person signing meeting for the following afternoon at the Apex Global Regional Headquarters. They prepared to walk into the glass boardroom as conquering titans, fully convinced their aristocratic arrogance had outmaneuvered my quiet defiance. They remained completely, blissfully oblivious that the phantom auditor orchestrating their buyout held the ripcord, and I intended to cut the parachute entirely. The morning of the Apex Global acquisition meeting broke over Boston in a shroud of bruised, heavy clouds. Ice encased the harbor. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, holding a cup of black espresso. I watched the commuter ferries cut jagged paths through the freezing water. I did not feel the typical adrenaline spike associated with corporate warfare. My pulse maintained a steady, resting rhythm. I turned away from the glass and walked toward the obsidian dining table. The dual monitors cast their familiar, icy blue light across the room. I initiated a final sweep of the Vanguard Logistics financial nodes. The corporate accounts remained decimated, flatlined at absolute zero following the extraction of the $4 million. A localized alert flared on my secondary screen. The custom web-scraping script I deployed to monitor Beacon Hill social forums triggered a cluster of rapid notifications. The digital chatter spiked. I opened the aggregated data feed, watching the rumors formalize into documented humiliation. The social fallout had finally reached Lorraine. My mother structured her entire existence around the approval of the Boston elite. She wielded her Vanguard corporate platinum card like a royal scepter, funding lavish luncheons to secure her dominance in the country club hierarchy. She operated under the delusion that Silas's wealth insulated her from consequence. The scraping algorithm pulled a thread from a restricted country club messaging board. I read the detailed, synchronized accounts of her collapse. Lorraine hosted a morning brunch for 6 prominent socialites in the private dining room of the Beacon Hill Country Club. She ordered imported caviar and vintage champagne, projecting the unshakable confidence of a matriarch. When the leather billfold arrived, she casually slid the Vanguard corporate card onto the silver tray. The waiter returned 3 minutes later. He did not bow. He did not offer a polite smile. He placed the declined card face down on the table. Lorraine, masking her initial panic with aristocratic irritation, produced a secondary gold card tied directly to Silas's personal accounts. The secondary card bounced. The country club manager materialized at the table. He did not whisper. He informed Lorraine, in full view of her guests, that all associated Vanguard accounts registered as frozen or severely overdrawn. The Elite Whisper Network operates with a velocity rivaling any fiber optic cable. The socialites sitting at her table already knew about the paralyzed delivery fleets. Their husbands served on corporate boards. They possessed the insider knowledge that Vanguard Logistics lacked the capital to refuel a single diesel engine. They did not offer to cover the bill. They did not offer sympathy. Hollow aristocrats abandon sinking ships the moment the deck touches water. The women gathered their designer handbags, murmured hollow excuses regarding afternoon appointments, and walked out of the private dining room. They left Lorraine sitting utterly alone at a table littered with empty champagne flutes, staring at a stack of declined plastic. The burner phone resting on the stone table vibrated. The screen illuminated, displaying a restricted caller identification. I allowed the device to rattle against the obsidian until the call routed to the automated answering service. An audio file appeared in my inbox. I clicked the play button. Lorraine's voice filled the quiet penthouse. The pristine, theatrical modulation she utilized at the Christmas party had entirely vanished. She gasped for air, her words fracturing under the weight of her unprecedented public humiliation. "Serenity, you need to answer the phone." Lorraine wept. Her breath hitched, producing a wet, desperate sound. The club manager humiliated me. My friends walked out. Silas is pacing the floor, screaming about the algorithms. "You are tearing this family apart over a childish grudge." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. She did not ask about my well-being. She did not acknowledge the forged medical affidavits or the attempt to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. She only recognized her own inconvenience. "You need to fix this right now," Lorraine demanded, her pitch escalating into a frantic, shrill command. "Restore the bank accounts, transfer the trust, come back to the house and be a good daughter, or I swear to you." I pressed the delete key. The audio file vanished, severing her voice mid-sentence. I did not listen to the threat. I did not require closure. I purged the voicemail from the server, dragging the file into the digital incinerator, permanently erasing her demands from my orbit. A second notification chimed. Distinct from the phone, a secure encrypted messaging application running on my desktop signaled an incoming transmission. The sender address consisted of a randomized alphanumeric string. The geographic locator pinged from a commercial terminal inside Los Angeles International Airport. Daphne. She utilized the untraceable cryptocurrency funds I provided to secure her extraction. She navigated the security checkpoints, bypassed Gideon's surveillance, and crossed the country undetected. I opened the encrypted text. It contained a single, decisive line. "I'm free. Burn it down." A quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. Daphne survived the blast radius. She severed her ties to the Vanguard toxicity, claiming her autonomy. I initiated a localized wipe command, scrubbing the decryption keys from my server. The messaging channel dissolved. Gideon possessed absolutely no digital breadcrumbs to track his wife. Her escape was absolute. My attention shifted back to the quarantine folder in my email client. Desmond continued to breach the perimeter. He operated under the assumption that I cowered in the shadows. Paralyzed by the loss of his companionship and terrified by the impending Apex Global acquisition, he fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of power. I clicked his incoming message. "Serenity," Desmond wrote, the text dripping with unearned arrogance. "Silas and I are finalizing the $50 million Apex buyout this afternoon. Your little software temper tantrum accomplished nothing but solidifying my position. Once the capital clears, Silas is authorizing a massive equity payout for my legal services. I will launch my own firm. I will possess more wealth than the partners who terminated me. You played your hand terribly. You could have shared this empire." I stared at the monitor, absorbing the staggering magnitude of his delusion. Desmond drafted forged tax returns. He submitted doctored balance sheets to a publicly traded tech conglomerate. He colluded to hide international money laundering. He committed these catastrophic federal felonies, yet he sat typing emails boasting about an imaginary victory. He believed a tailored suit and a hostile vocabulary immunized him against consequence. He remained blissfully unaware that the $50 million did not exist. He remained unaware that the Executive Auditing Committee reviewing his forged documents operated under my direct, unredacted command. I did not reply to his email. I did not require the last word. I required the final execution. I shut down the primary server arrays. The blue light faded from the monitors, plunging the command center back into the natural gray light of the winter afternoon. I disconnected the hardware authentication keys, sliding them into the interior pocket of my blazer. I walked into the master bedroom and retrieved my armor. I selected a tailored, charcoal suit cut with sharp, uncompromising lines. I fastened the buttons. I stepped into a pair of black, sensible heels footwear designed for marching into battle, not for decorating a country club luncheon. I checked my reflection in the full-length mirror. I saw no trace of the quiet, compliant daughter who endured decades of erasure. I saw a master system architect. I saw an apex predator. I walked back to the obsidian table and retrieved a sleek, black leather briefcase. I placed the physical copy of the final execution dossier inside. The thick stack of premium paper contained the server logs, the forged tax returns, the offshore routing hashes, and the Interpol red notices. It contained the absolute annihilation of Silas, Gideon, and Desmond. I snapped the brass locks shut. The sharp metallic click echoed in the silent penthouse. I picked up the briefcase, walked out the heavy oak door, and stepped into the elevator. The descent felt smooth and rapid. The hollow aristocrats gathered in the Apex Global glass boardroom, pouring champagne and celebrating a phantom acquisition. They waited for their golden parachute to deploy. I stepped out of the lobby and into a waiting black car, fully prepared to hand them an anvil. The black car pulled to a seamless halt in front of the Apex Global Regional Headquarters. I did not wait for the chauffeur to open my door. I pushed the heavy reinforced door outward. Stepping onto the pristine concrete plaza, the wind whipped off the Boston Harbor, sharp and unforgiving. But I did not pull my coat tight. I walked toward the towering monolith of glass and steel. Apex Global did not bother with the antiquated, mahogany-paneled aesthetic my father desperately clung to. The conglomerate projected absolute, brutal modernism. It functioned as a fortress of data, capital, and unrestricted leverage. I bypassed the main reception desk. The biometric security gates recognized my corporate credentials. Parting instantly, I strode into the private executive elevator bank. Two men wearing charcoal suits waited inside the cabin. They operated as the senior corporate counsel for the Apex Global Acquisitions Division. They possessed predatory legal minds, trained to dissect multi-million-dollar mergers and annihilate fraudulent contracts. They offered curt, silent nods as I took my position between them. We ascended 40 floors without a single mechanical vibration. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the executive auditing wing. Two federal compliance officers stood waiting in the corridor. They wore dark windbreakers, gold badges clipped to their belts, and expressions forged in absolute stone. They possessed the federal warrants secured by my metadata submissions. We formed a phalanx of legal and financial destruction, marching down the carpeted hallway toward the primary observation antechamber. Apex Global engineered their executive boardrooms with polarized, one-way acoustic glass. The architecture allowed auditing committees to observe acquisition targets prior to final negotiations. I stepped into the darkened antechamber. I looked through the glass partition. Silas, Gideon, and Desmond occupied the adjoining boardroom. The three men sat around a massive table carved from a single slab of petrified wood. They acted as conquering monarchs lounging in an acquired throne room. They had absolutely no idea they occupied a glass cage. Silas reached into a leather carrying case resting on the floor. He produced a bottle of vintage champagne. Bringing outside alcohol into a corporate acquisition meeting before securing a single signature violated every standard of professional etiquette. It demonstrated a staggering, foundational arrogance. Silas did not care. He assumed the $50 million transfer constituted a mere formality. He peeled the gold foil from the neck of the bottle and twisted the wire cage. The cork popped. The muffled sound carried through the hidden audio receivers in the ceiling, piping directly into the antechamber. Silas poured the foaming liquid into 3 crystal flutes he had arranged on the petrified wood. He slid the first glass toward Desmond. Desmond accepted the flute, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair. He adjusted his silk tie, his posture radiating unearned superiority. He aligned his yellow legal pads precisely parallel to the edge of the table. He prepared to act the part of a savior. He believed he had orchestrated the perfect corporate rescue, securing his own lucrative future by offering my autonomy as collateral. He stared at the blank doorway, waiting for the Apex executives to arrive and validate his brilliance. Silas raised his glass, gesturing expansively toward the Boston skyline stretching beyond the boardroom windows. "To the Vanguard legacy," Silas proclaimed, his voice dripping with condescension, "and to the complete neutralization of childish temper tantrums." Desmond chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. She genuinely believed terminating the Aegis contract would cripple the infrastructure. She lacks the fundamental capacity to understand high-level corporate maneuvering. We repackaged the deficit into a turnkey asset within 48 hours. By tomorrow morning, the $50 million will clear, the commercial debt vanishes, and my partnership contract executes. She brought a match to a hurricane, Silas agreed, swirling the champagne. He took a long, indulgent swallow. I warned her at the Christmas party. I told her she contributed nothing. Now, she sits freezing in the snow while we secure the largest capital injection in the history of the company. Let her keep her little algorithm. We just bought the entire grid. I stood in the darkness of the antechamber, listening to their voices through the overhead speakers. I watched my father celebrate his fabricated victory. He constructed a towering monument to his own ego, utilizing stolen capital, forged tax returns, and desperate lies as the mortar. My gaze shifted to Gideon. My brother did not project the same effortless arrogance. He held his champagne flute, but his knuckles strained tight against the crystal. A thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead. Catching the recessed lighting of the boardroom, his knee bounced in a rapid, erratic rhythm, striking the underside of the heavy table. Gideon checked the screen of his smartphone every 10 seconds. The offshore syndicates did not observe holidays. The bookies demanded their capital. He swiped away incoming notifications, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He stared at the digital clock mounted on the far wall. He calculated the exact moment the $50 million buyout would process, envisioning the wire transfers he needed to execute to keep his kneecaps intact. He believed the phantom tech executives walking through that door represented his literal physical salvation. They sat basking in the illusion of their supremacy. They waited for a faceless committee to hand them a golden parachute. I turned away from the polarized glass. I looked at the senior corporate counsel. I looked at the federal compliance officers. I adjusted my grip on the handle of my black leather briefcase. The brass locks dug into my palm, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. The briefcase contained the raw server logs, the forged signatures, the embezzled routing hashes, and the Interpol red notices. I offered a single, decisive nod. We stepped out of the antechamber and moved toward the primary entrance of the boardroom. I reached out and grasped the heavy, polished brass handles of the mahogany doors. I did not push them open gently. I drove my weight forward, throwing the doors apart with sudden, violent force. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls. The sharp, concussive impact echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous space. Inside the boardroom, the celebration shattered. Silas froze. His champagne flute stopped inches from his mouth, the golden liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Desmond snapped his head toward the entrance. His smug, sycophantic smile dissolved instantly, replaced by a mask of profound, uncomprehending shock. He gripped the edge of the petrified wood table, his knuckles turning stark white. Gideon dropped his smartphone. The device clattered loudly against the surface of the table, spinning before coming to a dead halt. I walked across the threshold. My heels struck the polished floor, laying down a sharp, rhythmic cadence. The two Apex corporate lawyers flanked me on my left. The two federal compliance officers took their positions on my right. We formed a barricade of absolute legal and financial authority, sealing the exits. The air inside the room grew thick and suffocating. The atmospheric pressure dropped, sucking the oxygen directly out of their lungs. I did not stop until I reached the head of the massive table. I stood directly opposite Silas. I looked at the three men who had spent their lives diminishing my existence. I saw the exact moment the delusion evaporated from their eyes. They looked at my tailored suit. They looked at the predatory posture of the corporate lawyers. They stared at the gold badges resting on the belts of the federal agents. They realized I did not arrive as a disgruntled daughter crashing a corporate meeting. I did not arrive to scream, cry, or beg for inclusion. I arrived as the apex predator, absolute. Paralyzing silence reigned over the glass boardroom. No one dared to draw a breath. No one dared to speak. The hollow aristocrats stared at the phantom auditor, waiting for the execution to commence. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around the glass boardroom like a physical vice. Silas stared at me, his jaw unhinging slightly. The crystal flute trembled in his hand, spilling a few drops of vintage champagne onto the petrified wood table. The golden liquid pooled against the grain, ignored. Desmond attempted to take a step backward. His heel caught the edge of a brass floor socket, sending him stumbling awkwardly against his leather executive chair. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning white to keep from falling to his knees. Gideon remained frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, as if his nervous system had short-circuited under the sheer impossibility of my presence. I did not yell. Shouting implies a loss of emotional control. I required absolute, clinical dominance over the space. I walked to the head of the massive table. The apex corporate lawyers took their positions at the perimeter, sealing the room. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. I extracted a thick, matte black cardstock. I placed it flat against the polished surface and pushed it forward with my index finger. The card glided across the table, generating a faint, whispering friction before coming to a dead halt inches from my father's trembling hand. Silas lowered his gaze. He read the embossed silver lettering. The text detailed my name, my credentials, and my title, Lead External Forensic Auditor, Acquisitions Division, Apex Global. "You submitted a $50 million acquisition proposal," I stated. My voice dropped to a lethal, icy whisper. It carried zero emotional inflection, resonating with uncompromising detachment. Corporate protocol dictates that an external auditor must verify the financial architecture of any purchase exceeding $20 million. You did not submit your proposal to a faceless committee. Silas, you submitted it directly to my desk. Silas swallowed hard. The dry click in his throat amplified in the dead air. He clutched his chest, his fingers digging into the fabric of his bespoke suit jacket. The realization hit his bloodstream with devastating force. The golden parachute vanished into the atmosphere. The $50 million did not exist. He had walked willingly, eagerly, into an execution chamber. I lifted the black leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the table. I snapped the brass locks open. The sharp metallic cracks echoed like a whip. I reached inside and pulled out the final execution dossier. Let us review the balance sheets you provided to this publicly traded conglomerate, I commanded. I tossed the first stack of documents toward Desmond, the heavy pages scattered across the table, sliding over the spilled champagne. Desmond, you drafted these tax returns, I continued, pinning him with a dead, unblinking stare. You manipulated the gross revenue figures. You created phantom warehouse leases and falsified diesel fuel invoices to mask the sudden disappearance of $4 million in operating capital. I ran cryptographic hash checks on your submissions. The metadata confirms you forged the Internal Revenue Service watermarks using unauthorized local software less than 24 hours ago. Desmond opened his mouth. His throat worked convulsively, attempting to generate sound. The arrogant, untouchable litigator evaporated, leaving a terrified civilian in his place. This is a confidential negotiation, Desmond stammered, stepping entirely away from the chair. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trying to construct a frantic, invisible shield. Any internal Vanguard documents I prepared fall under strict attorney-client privilege. You lack the legal authority to audit these files without a subpoena. I demand you cease this review immediately. I did not blink. I reached back into the briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper. You possess zero legal authority in this room, Desmond, I countered. I slid the printed email across the table. I extracted the metadata from the fraudulent cease and desist letter you sent me. I routed the proof of your unbilled, off-the-books extortion directly to the senior managing partners at your firm. Desmond stared at the email. The ink spelled out his complete professional ruin. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. They reviewed the evidence of your malpractice last night, I informed him, my tone devoid of pity. They terminated your employment effective at 8 o'clock this morning. They revoked your corporate access and forwarded your extortion attempt to the State Bar Association. You do not represent Vanguard Logistics. You do not hold a law license. You are an unemployed civilian trespassing in a restricted corporate facility. Desmond staggered backward. He collided with the glass wall of the boardroom, his hands sliding uselessly against the smooth, cold surface. He slid down the glass, a hollow, trembling shell of the man who had promised to lock me in a psychiatric cage. I turned my attention away from the neutralized traitor and focused entirely on my bloodline. I retrieved a compact remote from the podium built into the table. I aimed it at the far wall and pressed the primary button. A massive, high-definition projection screen descended silently from the ceiling. A laser projector hummed to life, casting a brilliant, sharp image across the canvas. While Desmond committed federal tax fraud, you two attempted a cyber heist. I addressed Silas and Gideon. I clicked the remote. The screen displayed the raw server logs from the previous night. At midnight, Black Hat contractors breached a sandbox server I intentionally left open, I explained. I pointed to the cascading lines of code illuminating the dark room. They uploaded a forged transfer of ownership, attempting to steal the Aegis software and the $4 million. They utilized offshore proxies, but my deep packet inspection protocol stripped their obfuscation. I clicked the remote a second time. The screen flashed, revealing the unmasked Internet Protocol addresses. The attack originated from an Eastern European server farm, but the command node traces directly to Vanguard headquarters, I stated, staring at Gideon. You sat at your desk, communicating with the mercenaries. You authorized the forgery of my signature. You handed me time-stamped, irrefutable proof of domestic identity theft and international wire fraud. Gideon shrunk into his chair. He crossed his arms over his chest, rocking slightly back and forth. His eyes darted toward the exits, calculating a physical escape route. But the federal compliance officers blocked the heavy mahogany doors. Their stances remained wide, their hands resting near their belts. And the motivation for your cyber assault resides in your offshore accounts, I added. I pressed the remote one final time. The projector displayed the master financial map. Thick red lines connected Vanguard's operating capital to holding companies in the Cayman Islands. Beside the routing numbers, active Interpol red notices glared in stark, uncompromising detail. You did not modernize the fleet, Gideon, I exposed, ensuring my voice reached the federal agents standing at the perimeter. You embezzled corporate funds to pay an underground gambling syndicate. You routed hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into a heavily surveilled criminal enterprise. By submitting these ledgers to Apex Global, you attempted to inject cartel-linked money into a publicly traded company. Gideon let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He dropped his head onto the petrified wood, burying his face in his arms. He understood the absolute finality of his position. The offshore bookies no longer posed his primary threat. The federal government owned his future. Silas collapsed into his leather chair. The tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, wrapping a defeated, broken man. He clutched his chest with both hands, dragging ragged, shallow breaths into his lungs. The reality of his complete destruction crushed his respiratory system. He looked at the projection screen. He looked at the federal agents. Finally, he looked at me. The $50 million acquisition vanished into thin air. The Vanguard empire he prized above my existence lay in ashes. His son faced international money laundering charges. His lawyer faced disbarment. He possessed no algorithm, no liquid capital, and no future outside a federal courtroom. I stood at the head of the table, surveying the wreckage. I had systematically dismantled their false aristocracy, exposing the criminal rot beneath the floorboards. The execution was absolute, surgical, and complete. Silas reached across the expanse of the petrified wood table. His fingers trembled, scraping against the polished surface as he attempted to bridge the distance between us. His aristocratic posture evaporated entirely. He shrank inside his bespoke suit jacket, the fabric bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. The blood had abandoned his face, leaving his skin holding the pallor of a corpse. He stared at the projection screen, examining the undeniable digital footprints of his own extortion. He looked at the Apex corporate lawyers securing the perimeter. He looked at the federal compliance officers. Finally, he looked at me. Serenity. Silas gasped. His voice cracked, stripped of its booming, theatrical resonance. He attempted to project paternal authority, but his lungs produced only a hollow, pathetic wheeze. "You cannot do this," Silas pleaded, his hands shaking violently against the table. "You are my daughter. We share the same blood. We are family. You must terminate this presentation. We can restructure the board of directors. We can allocate a majority equity stake directly to you. We can repair this, please." I looked at the man who had spent 3 decades demanding I shrink myself to accommodate his towering, fragile ego. I did not soften. I did not experience a single surge of daughterly guilt. I analyzed his words and found nothing but transactional desperation. He did not offer an apology. He offered a bribe. "Family does not forge medical affidavits to lock their own blood inside a psychiatric ward," I stated. My tone remained entirely clinical, slicing through the heavy air of the boardroom. Family does not steal $4 million to subsidize offshore gambling syndicates. You do not want a daughter, Silas. You want a hostage. Silas opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed to engage. I leaned forward, resting my palms against the cool edge of the table. I locked my eyes directly onto his terrified gaze, refusing to let him look away from the architect of his ruin. At the Christmas party, you stood in front of 150 guests and demanded I surrender my grandfather's trust. I reminded him, my voice dropping to a lethal, absolute calm. When I refused to subsidize your incompetence, you looked me in the eye and told me I should never have existed. Silas flinched, his shoulders pulled inward as the memory of his own cruelty struck him. Consider this my absence. I finalized. I stood upright. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and withdrew a brushed steel pen. I pulled the official Apex Global Acquisition Authorization form from the top of the dossier. Silas tracked my movements, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. I did not authorize the $50 million transfer. I pressed the steel nib against the signature line. I slashed a thick, diagonal line across the document and wrote a single word in bold. Black ink, denied. I slid the paper toward the center of the table, leaving it to rest in a puddle of spilled vintage champagne. I closed the cover of the execution dossier. I snapped the brass locks of my briefcase shut. The metallic crack echoed with undeniable finality. The $50 million lifeline ceased to exist. Before Silas could form a single word of protest, the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the boardroom swung open a second time. The federal compliance officers stepped aside, granting entry to a specialized tactical unit. 6 agents representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation crossed the threshold. They wore dark suits and displayed gold shields secured to their belts. They did not announce themselves with dramatic shouts or drawn weapons. They operated with ruthless, practiced efficiency. The lead agent held a thick stack of manila folders containing the federal warrants I had generated through my data submissions. "Silas and Gideon," the lead agent announced. His voice projected unquestionable, state-sanctioned authority. "We hold federal warrants for your arrest." Gideon shattered. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed onto his knees, striking the hard floor with a dull thud. He wept, unleashing high-pitched, guttural sobs that bounced off the glass walls. He buried his face in his hands, his chest heaving as he realized the offshore syndicates and the federal government had simultaneously laid claim to his life. The lead agent read the charges aloud, etching their crimes into the public record. The charges include conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. 2 agents closed the distance across the room. They grasped Gideon by his upper arms, hoisting his dead weight upward. They pulled his wrists behind his back. The cold, metallic ratchet of steel handcuffs clicked sharply, locking Gideon into his new reality. He continued to sob, begging the agents to let him call his wife, entirely unaware that Daphne sat safely on the opposite side of the continent. Silas did not weep. He slumped backward into his leather executive chair. The remaining oxygen left his body. His jaw hung slack. He stared blindly at the projection screen, watching the unmasked rooting hashes condemn him, his legacy, his wealth, and his aristocratic illusion burned to ash right in front of his eyes. 2 agents moved to secure him. They instructed Silas to stand. He complied mechanically, functioning as a hollow, vacated shell guided by federal handlers. They secured his wrists. The patriarch of Vanguard Logistics stood bound, facing the complete, unmitigated destruction of his empire. Desmond observed the federal intervention and attempted to distance himself from the wreckage. He sidestepped toward the exit, keeping his back pressed against the glass partition, hoping to slip unnoticed into the corridor. The Apex corporate lawyers blocked his path. They gestured to the building security detail waiting in the antechamber. 2 massive security contractors entered the boardroom. They converged on Desmond, grabbing him by his shoulders. "Unhand me," Desmond sputtered, his voice cracking as he struggled against their grip. "I am legal counsel. I invoke attorney-client privilege. You expose yourselves to massive civil litigation." The contractors ignored his frantic threats entirely. They knew he lacked a law license. They knew he lacked a firm. They marched the disgraced, disbarred traitor out of the executive wing, dragging him by his elbows and treating him like a common, unwanted trespasser. I watched the physical removal of the men who had attempted to destroy my autonomy. The boardroom emptied in a matter of minutes, leaving behind only the scent of fear, the spilled champagne, and the scattered, forged tax returns resting on the petrified wood. I picked up my black leather briefcase. I did not look at the empty chairs. I turned my back on the wreckage. I walked out of the glass enclosure. My heels struck the marble corridor, laying down a steady, triumphant rhythm. I kept my head held high, breathing in the clean, sterile air of the corporate fortress. I walked toward the elevator, leaving them to the exact, inescapable justice they had engineered for themselves. 6 months elapsed, turning the biting, relentless winter into the humid, heavy heat of a Boston summer. The passage of time did not heal the Vanguard Logistics empire. It merely allowed the federal justice system to execute the final, clinical autopsy. The federal bankruptcy court operated with a sterile, mechanical rhythm entirely devoid of sentiment. I sat in the rear gallery of the courtroom, watching the liquidation proceedings unfold. Commercial creditors, logistics contractors, and diesel suppliers descended upon the corporate carcass. They filed involuntary petitions, tearing apart the structural framework Silas had spent 3 decades building. The federal judge, a stern woman possessing zero tolerance for financial shell games, struck her wooden gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the paneled room, officially dissolving Vanguard Logistics as a sovereign corporate entity. Silas did not attend the hearing in a bespoke suit. He observed the liquidation of his legacy via a secure video feed from a federal holding facility. The prosecution refused to grant bail, classifying him as a severe flight risk due to the unmasked offshore routing hashes I provided in the execution dossier. The Asset Forfeiture Division mobilized with breathtaking speed. Federal agents seized the sprawling Beacon Hill mansion. They auctioned the imported crystal chandeliers, the antique mahogany desks, and the vintage Scotch collections to cover the massive federal restitution orders. They impounded the fleet of luxury vehicles. They drained the remaining personal accounts down to absolute zero. The aristocratic illusion shattered into dust, swept away by the precise, unrelenting machinery of the law. I did not attend the bankruptcy auction to gloat. I attended as a strategic buyer possessing bottomless, unencumbered capital. Vanguard possessed no proprietary software. They possessed no operational liquidity. They possessed only physical infrastructure, a sprawling network of delivery trucks, distribution hubs, and cargo ships rotting on the docks. The corporate market viewed these decaying assets as toxic liabilities. I viewed them as hardware, awaiting an operating system. I established a new corporate entity, heavily fortified by the reclaimed $4 million and the substantial capital generated from my Zenith data forensics contracts. I sat in the auction house, raising a numbered plastic paddle with calculated rhythmic precision. I purchased the core physical assets of Vanguard Logistics for pennies on the dollar. I acquired the primary distribution warehouses across the eastern seaboard. I bought the dormant fleet of 18-wheelers. I integrated the physical hardware directly into the digital nervous system of Aegis Systems. I did not retain the Vanguard branding. I dispatched industrial contractors to the newly acquired distribution hubs. I stood on the cracked asphalt and watched men in heavy harnesses lower the massive, illuminated Vanguard signs from the warehouse facades. The metal letters hit the ground, kicking up clouds of dust. Painters applied thick coats of matte black and silver to the truck cabins, erasing Silas's name under layers of industrial enamel. I installed my proprietary routing algorithm directly into the onboard computers. I opened my encrypted tablet. The green dots on my operational dashboard flared to life. The engines turned over, the trucks moved, the supply chain breathed. I possessed the software, and now I possess the steel. I built a tangible, physical empire entirely upon the grave of my abusers. The men who attempted to steal my autonomy secured their own permanent cages. The federal judge handed down the sentences in late spring. Gideon broke completely during the trial. He attempted to leverage a plea deal by testifying against his offshore bookies, but the international syndicates abandoned him the moment the federal government froze his holding companies. He stood before the bench, trembling inside a standard issue, khaki federal jumpsuit. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in a maximum security penitentiary for international money laundering and corporate embezzlement. The underground gambling ring he desperately tried to pay off evaporated, replaced by federal wardens, concrete walls, and reinforced steel bars. Silas received no leniency. The prosecution utilized the forged medical affidavits and the intercepted server logs as foundational evidence of his malicious intent. He lacked the capital to hire elite defense attorneys, relying on overworked public defenders who possessed zero capability to dismantle my cryptographic hashes. The patriarch who demanded absolute obedience received a 15-year sentence for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He traded his vintage champagne for a metal cot. He would spend the remainder of his cognitive life locked inside a federal facility, entirely forgotten by the high society he worshipped. Desmond evaded federal prison, but he did not escape total, inescapable ruin. The State Bar Association executed a swift, brutal investigation into the off-the-books extortion I exposed. The disciplinary committee stripped his law license permanently. They barred him from practicing law in any capacity across the country. The elite corporate firm he betrayed erased his name from their directories. The man who drafted fraudulent conservatorships to secure a partnership promotion now lacked the credentials to notarize a basic contract. He faded into absolute obscurity, a disgraced, irrelevant civilian stripped of the only weapon he possessed. Lorraine fled to a smaller, less prestigious suburb, her social currency utterly bankrupt. The country club formally erased her membership. The women she courted treated her like a contagion. She sat in a rented townhouse, surrounded by a few salvaged designer handbags, clinging to the phantom memory of a dynasty that no longer existed. Daphne remained safe on the West Coast, sending a single, encrypted postcard of the Pacific Ocean, a silent acknowledgement of the blast radius we both survived, and the freedom we both claimed. I stood on the wraparound balcony of my new corporate headquarters. I secured the top 3 floors of a towering glass high-rise in the financial district. The architecture mirrored my operating principles, transparent, modern, and built upon unshakable foundations. I rested my hands against the tempered glass railing. The city of Boston sprawled below me, a chaotic, glittering grid of asphalt and steel. My delivery fleets navigated the arteries of the metropolis, guided by the algorithms I authored in the dark. For 31 years, I existed as a designated scapegoat. I absorbed the insults, the marginalization, and the relentless demands to shrink my intellect to accommodate the fragile egos of incompetent men. I operated as a ghost, hiding my capabilities behind anonymous proxies to avoid triggering their malice. I inhaled the clean, sterile air rising off the harbor. The wind whipped my hair back, sharp and invigorating. I no longer required camouflage. I did not need a Beacon Hill mansion to validate my worth. I did not require an aristocratic bloodline to secure my power. I dismantled a corrupt dynasty using nothing but logic, data, and absolute, uncompromising boundaries. I reclaimed my grandfather's trust, expanded my forensic architecture, and acquired an entire physical supply chain. I looked down at the streets. I saw a world driven by metrics, actions, and consequences. I stood at the apex of my own creation. I am no longer a hidden ghost or a scapegoat. I am the undisputed architect of my own empire. The story of Serenity's flawless triumph illuminates a profound truth. True power is never loud, and it cannot be demanded by toxic relatives attempting to steal your light. When arrogant people mistake your quiet endurance for weakness, they invite their own destruction. You are not obligated to shrink yourself to protect the fragile egos of those who share your blood, your expertise, your self-reliance, and your unshakable boundaries are your ultimate armor. If this story empowered you to recognize your own worth and stop accepting abuse in the name of family, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, never wait for permission to claim your power. Goodbye.